Hey guys, tonight we slip back in time to a place where the flicker of torchlight throws long shadows across stone walls, and every cough or shuffle in the crowd feels amplified by the silence of anticipation. You find yourself pressed shoulder to shoulder with villagers, nobles, and merchants alike, all gathering to watch what passes for justice in the Middle Ages. It's not the calm, sterile courtroom you might picture today with judges in robes and neat rows of wooden benches. No, here the court is more of a stage, a place where spectacle outweighs fairness, and where the judgment of God, or at least what men claim to be God's judgment, becomes the deciding factor. You probably won't survive this, at least not if you're unlucky enough to stand accused. The smell of tallow candles mixes with damp earth and smoke, while the air hums with whispers of gossip, vengeance, and fear. Men tug their cloaks tighter against the chill. Women clutch rosaries as if faith alone might shield them. And somewhere a child points, asking why everyone has come together tonight. The answer is simple. They've come to watch, to bear witness, to cheer or jeer at the fates of their neighbors. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your gaze moves toward the makeshift bench at the far end of the hall, where a figure draped in authority sits. A judge, sometimes more priest than lawyer, wielding a power that feels absolute. Behind him looms a crucifix, a reminder that every verdict here is supposedly guided not by human reasoning, but by divine will. It's unsettling because, unlike modern systems where evidence and testimony matter, in this world, guilt or innocence is often decided by ritual, ordeal, or sheer whimsy. And as you shuffle closer to get a better view, the proceedings begin to unfold. The first sound you hear isn't the solemn voice of law, but the bark of a bailiff calling for order, followed by laughter, coughing, even the rustle of hay underfoot. This isn't about dignity, it's entertainment. Trials attract crowds the way a football game might today. Instead of touchdowns, you watch neighbors tested by fire, water, or blade. People sell snacks outside, gossip runs thick, and children may remember these nights the way you remember your first concert. Justice is spectacle, plain and simple. You notice how much of this is theater. The accused, often weary farmers or frightened women, are dragged forward in rough tunics, their eyes darting from judge to mob. Sometimes the charges are serious: murder, theft, treason. Other times they're laughably small: stealing bread, quarreling too loudly, or daring to speak ill of the local lord. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly believed these trials were fair or whether they simply accepted them as part of survival. Either way, if you were in the crowd, you'd quickly realize that truth and evidence hold little weight compared to drama and fear. And then comes the ritual. If the trial involves fire, you might watch the priest bless a glowing bar of iron before handing it to the accused. If water, you'll see ropes tied and the accused tossed into a river. If combat, sharpened swords glint under torchlight as crowds cheer like it's a tournament. It's surreal, terrifying, and captivating all at once, because the courtroom isn't about deciding truth. It's about watching fate unfold. The fringe tidbit here, the one you'll raise your eyebrows at, is that animals were sometimes part of this same system. Yes, entire courts convened to try pigs for biting children or locusts for ruining crops. Imagine the solemnity of a judge lecturing a rooster about disturbing the peace. It sounds absurd, but for medieval people, it reinforced that justice was all-encompassing, that order had to be restored even against creatures without reason. As you linger in this hall, pressed close among villagers, you can feel the mixture of fear and thrill. The crackle of torches makes the shadows dance, and every time the judge bangs the table, the crowd leans forward as if God himself might speak. And while some part of you wants to laugh at the absurdity of it all, another part recognizes the danger, because laughter at the wrong moment might brand you suspicious. It's easy to imagine yourself there, standing in the crowd, clutching your cloak, whispering about who might be accused next. Maybe it's the widow who lives on the edge of the village. Maybe it's the miller who watered down the grain. Maybe, if you're unlucky, it's you. The drama of medieval courts isn't distant history. It's a reminder of how fragile justice can feel when fear and superstition rule the day. The night grows colder, the candles burn lower, and the trial moves forward with an energy that feels both electric and deeply unsettling. This is only the beginning of your journey, a first taste of how the medieval world handled disputes, fear, and punishment. Soon, you'll feel the heat of iron, the chill of water, and the clang of weapons as ordeal after ordeal shows just how strange and how brutal justice once was. The torches crackle, and you edge closer to the front of the hall. Tonight's ordeal isn't about words or testimony. It's about fire, trial by fire. The phrase alone sends a shiver down your spine, but here it's taken literally. You watch as a young man accused of stealing a sheep is dragged forward. He's trembling barefoot, his tunic torn at the sleeves. The judge, or perhaps it's the priest, sometimes it's hard to tell where law ends and faith begins, raises a hand for silence. Then, with solemn gravity, a glowing iron bar is brought in from the hearth. The heat radiates through the hall, and even from a distance you can feel it prickling against your skin. The villagers press closer, children balanced on shoulders to get a view, women whispering prayers, men muttering bets on whether the boy will last. It isn't about truth, not really. It's about proof by pain, the idea that God will protect the innocent and punish the guilty. You lean forward, almost holding your breath, because now comes the moment everyone's waiting for. The priest chants, sprinkles holy water on the iron as if blessing it makes it fairer. Then the accused is told to hold the bar, to carry it 3 measured steps across the hall. His hands hover, hesitant, and you can almost hear his thoughts. Does he trust that God will shield him? Or is he already condemned? The crowd hisses, some shouting encouragement, others jeering. And then, with a cry, he grips the glowing metal. The smell hits you first, a sharp, metallic tang mixed with the bitter stench of scorched flesh. The boy stumbles forward, his face twisted in agony, clutching the bar for those 3 steps that feel like eternity. He drops it at the priest's feet, collapses, and the hall erupts in noise, cheers, groans, laughter, pity. Justice, it seems, is entertainment after all. But the ordeal isn't finished yet. The true test comes later. His burned hands are wrapped in cloth, and in 3 days' time they'll be examined. If the wounds are healing cleanly, he's declared innocent. If they fester, he's guilty. Historians still argue whether this was truly believed as divine judgment or whether it was simply a way for communities to externalize guilt, pushing responsibility onto God rather than themselves. Either way, standing in that smoky hall, you feel how heavy the stakes are. And here's a quirky tidbit. Sometimes, instead of a glowing iron, the accused had to walk barefoot over 9 red-hot plowshares laid out in a row. Imagine lining up 9 miniature ovens and being told to stroll casually across. It's no wonder people often tried to settle disputes outside of court, anything to avoid the ordeal. The crowd, of course, thrives on the spectacle. This is their theater, their drama. For you, it feels unsettlingly like watching a game you can't turn off. The boy whimpers as he's carried away, his fate hanging on whether blisters look holy or sinful. And as the judge clears his throat, ready to call the next case, you realize there's no rest here. Each accusation means another soul tested by flame. You imagine yourself in his place. Maybe you're accused of gossiping too loudly, or perhaps your neighbor doesn't like the way you looked at his cow. Suddenly, you're holding that iron, the heat burning through to your bones. There's no jury of your peers, no lawyer to argue your case, only fire, faith, and the eyes of your entire community. It's a nightmare you can't wake from. The irony is thick. Fire was supposed to reveal purity, burning away lies the way gold is refined. But you can't help thinking that everyone, guilty or innocent, would blister and scar. The truth lies not in divine will, but in how quickly wounds heal, or perhaps how merciful the local priest feels when he unwraps the bandages. And yet, despite its cruelty, people believed, or at least they acted as if they did. Maybe they feared questioning the system, or maybe they truly thought God's hand guided every burn and blister. The hall quiets as another accused steps forward, this time a woman accused of slandering her neighbor. She too must grip the iron, her lips moving in silent prayer. You look around the crowd at the faces illuminated by torchlight and see a mixture of pity, curiosity, and grim satisfaction. You stifle a nervous laugh because if Netflix had existed back then, it would have been canceled for being too unrealistic. But for these people, it was real life. And as the iron is lifted once again, glowing orange against the darkness, you realize this isn't just punishment. It's ritual, spectacle, and a reminder of how fragile innocence can be when fire decides your fate. The trial shifts from fire to water, and you feel the damp chill settle over the hall as ropes are prepared. Tonight, innocence or guilt won't be determined by burns or blisters, but by whether you sink or float. It sounds absurd even as you watch it unfold, yet here in the medieval imagination, water is a divine substance, too pure to accept the guilty. So if you float, the water rejects you, meaning you're guilty. If you sink, you're innocent, but possibly drowned. You shake your head. It's the kind of justice where you win by dying and lose by surviving. You follow the crowd outside, torches flickering against stone walls until everyone gathers at the edge of a pond just beyond the village. The air smells of mud and algae. The reeds whisper in the wind. The nervous hush falls over the spectators. The accused tonight is a woman, maybe 40, with a kerchief tied tight over her hair. Someone whispers, "Witch," under their breath, and you feel the tension ripple outward. She's bound at the wrists and ankles, a rope knotted around her waist so she can be hauled back if necessary. The priest recites a prayer invoking God's judgment, and then, without ceremony, she's shoved into the water. There's a splash, and ripples shimmer outward as the crowd leans forward. For a moment she sinks, bubbles rising, and you think maybe this time innocence will prevail. But then, to the crowd's murmuring excitement, her body bobs back up, floating awkwardly at the surface, gasps, then whispers, "Confirmation." The water has rejected her. Guilty. You can't help but feel the unfairness of it. If she had sunk, she might have drowned before anyone admitted she was innocent. Float, and she's condemned anyway. Historians still argue whether villagers truly believed the water had divine judgment or whether it was just a convenient way to get rid of troublesome neighbors. Either way, you realize the accused never really stood a chance. A quirky tidbit here. In some places, the accused wasn't tossed in at random but carefully lowered, tied to a specially carved chair or stool. The community took their symbolism very seriously. This wasn't just dunking someone in a pond. It was staging a sacred test. And in a strange way, the rope tied around her waist was considered an act of mercy, even though everyone knew that if she floated, the rope was only there to drag her back for punishment. The crowd erupts in chatter as she's pulled out, sputtering and coughing. Children laugh nervously, a few older women cross themselves, and the judge nods grimly as if the outcome had been clear all along. The woman's face twists with desperation. How do you argue against water? How do you protest that floating isn't a crime? You can almost taste the hopelessness in the air, sharp and bitter. And then you imagine yourself in her place. Perhaps you'd been accused of witchcraft simply for knowing a few herbs, or for being a widow living alone. The rope cinches tight. The cold mud squelches between your toes as you're dragged to the water's edge. Do you hope to sink, trusting someone will pull you out in time? Or do you pray to float and then try to explain the absurdity? Either way, your fate isn't really yours to decide. The irony of it gnaws at you. Water, the source of life, turned into an instrument of judgment. The villagers nod as if reassured, as though they've seen divine will in action. Yet you know what you've seen. Physics, not miracles. But saying that aloud would be dangerous. A single skeptical laugh. And suddenly, you might be the one bound and pushed into the pond next. A man beside you claps his friend on the back and jokes that if he were accused, he'd just hold his breath better. The crowd chuckles, but beneath the humor is unease. They all know it could just as easily be them. And you realize that in this world, justice isn't about fairness. It's about maintaining order through fear, even if that order means drowning or declaring someone guilty for the crime of floating. As the woman is dragged, shivering back toward the hall, you catch her eye for just a second. It's not defiance you see there, but a hollow resignation. She already knows her fate is sealed. You shiver, not just from the night air, but from the cruel absurdity of it all. Trial by water is less about truth and more about spectacle. Another reminder that in the medieval world, survival often had nothing to do with innocence. The crowd isn't heading back indoors just yet. Instead, they shuffle toward the open field outside the village walls where torches already circle a patch of flattened grass. Tonight's trial is no whispered prayer over relics or awkward dunking in the pond. Tonight, justice comes, with steel and sweat. Trial by combat. You take your place among the villagers, the cold night air brushing your face as you watch two men step forward. One is broad-shouldered, clutching a wooden shield and rusty sword. The other, thinner but wiry, carries a cudgel. They're not knights in gleaming armor. They're just townsmen dragged into a brutal game that no one really wins. The idea is simple. Let God decide. Whoever walks away victorious must be the one telling the truth. Whoever falls, well, that person clearly lied, or so the logic goes. Historians still argue whether medieval communities actually trusted divine intervention in these brawls, or whether it was just an excuse for blood sport that reinforced local order. Either way, you sense the crowd's anticipation. The women lean forward, children squirm on the shoulders, men shout wagers, and you feel as though you're ringside at the strangest sporting event of the century. A priest raises his hand for silence and mutters a blessing, as if sanctifying a fight to the death makes it less brutal. The judge declares the charges, a dispute over land boundaries. One man claiming another built a fence on his property. Instead of maps or witnesses, tonight's answer will be written in bruises. With a grunt, the combatants step into the ring of light. The first clash of weapons sends sparks into the dark. The clang echoes, and the crowd roars approval. Dust rises as feet shuffle, blades scrape, and breath comes ragged. You can almost taste the iron in the air as if the weapons themselves exhale. Each strike is cheered, each stumble jeered. You wince as the cudgel thuds against a shoulder, then gasp as the sword barely misses its target. There's a strange intimacy to it. You're watching two men bleed and strain for honor, for survival, and for something as trivial as a fence line. And you can't help but imagine, what if it were you? Maybe your neighbor accused you of cheating at market or of eyeing his wife too long. Would you step into the ring, your hands clammy, your weapon unsteady? Victory means you keep your home and your reputation. Defeat means dishonor at best, death at worst. Here's a quirky tidbit. Women weren't entirely exempt. In some rare cases, a woman could be called to trial by combat. To make it fair, she might be armed with a stone wrapped in cloth, while her male opponent had to fight waist-deep in a pit. Picture the awkwardness of that duel, half gladiator match, half comedy of errors. Still, the outcome was treated as binding proof of guilt or innocence. The fight before you drags on. Sweat drips, grunts grow louder, and the thinner man's arms tremble under the cudgel's weight. The bigger man presses his advantage, shield slamming, sword striking, and then, with one last push, he knocks the cudgel aside and drives the other to the ground. The crowd erupts, cheers, claps, even laughter. The loser groans, clutching his ribs, but it doesn't matter. The verdict has been delivered. He is guilty because he lost. Simple as that. Yet you feel uneasy. Did God really choose the victor, or was it just muscle and luck? The judge nods solemnly, pretending divinity is spoken. But you can see the truth. The bigger man was stronger, better fed, maybe just luckier tonight. Tomorrow, roles reversed. Perhaps the outcome would change. Still, no one dares voice the thought. The community accepts the ruling. Property lines are settled, reputation salvaged, all through the brutal theater of combat. You shift your weight in the grass, aware of how flimsy fairness feels here. Trial by combat isn't just about justice, it's about control, about channeling conflict into something visible and final. The villagers, satisfied with their night's entertainment, begin to disperse. Torches dim, laughter fades, and the man on the ground is dragged away. You can't help but picture yourself again, standing in that circle, blade in hand, heart hammering. Would you fight clean? Would you cheat? Would you pray every swing that God or luck was on your side? Either way, the crowd would cheer, the judge would nod, and your fate would be sealed in bruises and blood. The night is still heavy with the echoes of combat when the crowd drifts back into the hall. The air smells of smoke and sweat, and the glow of torchlight reveals the next ordeal waiting. This time, there are no weapons, no pawns, no glowing iron bars. Instead, there's a small wooden box carried carefully to the judge's bench, and whispers ripple through the crowd. Tonight's trial will be decided by an oath sworn on holy relics. You watch as the priest lifts the lid to reveal a reliquary, a small gilded container said to hold the finger bone of a saint. Its polished metal gleams, catching the torchlight, and for a moment the entire hall feels hushed, reverent. It's not about spectacle now, but about sacred fear. The accused, a weary-looking merchant with ink-stained fingers, is brought forward. He's been accused of cheating his customers, watering down his wine, and everyone in the room wants to see whether he dares to lie before the bones of a saint. The priest holds out the reliquary, chanting in Latin. The accused must place his hand upon it and swear the truth, knowing that if he lies, divine punishment will surely follow. You lean closer, trying to catch every flicker of expression on his face. Does he tremble? Does he hesitate? His eyes dart between the relic and the crowd, and then he presses his palm against the cold metal. His voice wavers as he swears innocence. The room exhales collectively. Some nod as if convinced, others whisper doubts. Historians still argue whether people truly believed relics could punish liars instantly, or whether the oath was more about social pressure, a way to frighten someone into confession. Either way, you can feel the weight of belief pressing down like a hand on your shoulder. Here, the fear isn't of drowning or burning. It's of invisible judgment, the idea that heaven itself might smite you if your words are false. A quirky tidbit slips through your thoughts. Sometimes relics weren't bones at all. Towns boasted scraps of cloth said to be from Christ's robe, drops of blood that never dried, or even feathers claimed to be from the Archangel Michael's wings. Imagine swearing truth on a feather in a glass box. Absurd, maybe, but in a world hungry for certainty, anything sacred could carry weight. The merchant lowers his hand, visibly sweating. The judge narrows his eyes, studying him as though divine truth will manifest in a twitch or a tremor. The crowd waits, murmuring. Someone coughs, another stifles a laugh, and you realize again how much theater is baked into all of this. Justice here is equal parts ritual and performance, where the accused must convince not just the judge, but the collective gaze of the entire village. You picture yourself standing in his place. Perhaps you're accused of shortchanging someone at market, or of keeping an extra chicken that should have gone to the tithe. Would you swear on a relic knowing you were guilty? Would you risk lightning bolts from the sky, or would fear alone break you down into confession? The merchant insists he's innocent, voice steadier now, and the relic is returned to its box. For tonight at least, he's free, but you can sense the unease in the hall. Some still doubt him, whispering that the saint's finger didn't glow because perhaps the priest wasn't holy enough, or the reliquary was dusty. Others mutter that God works in mysterious ways and punishment might come later. Either way, the man will never quite escape suspicion, and you can't help but smile wryly. In a time without lie detectors or forensic science, this was their polygraph, an oath sealed by the weight of the sacred. It might seem silly now, swearing on a splinter of wood or a lock of hair, but for these villagers, it was deadly serious. Belief itself was the punishment, because once you swore and walked away, everyone watched to see if misfortune struck you down. The hall begins to quiet again, the reliquary tucked safely away. The merchant shuffles back into the crowd, pale but still breathing. Around you, villagers trade stories of past trials. One man swore on a relic and was struck by illness weeks later. Another confessed before even touching it. You realize the relic's power isn't in the object itself, but in the fear it stirs. And in this world, fear is as sharp as any blade. The relics are tucked away, the murmurs die down, and the judge signals for the next case. This one is quieter, less theatrical than the fire and water ordeals, but somehow more nerve-wracking. A wooden table is brought forward, and on it is set a simple meal. A hunk of coarse bread, yellowish from rye flour, and a wedge of sharp, dry cheese. The villagers nudge each other knowingly. This is the trial by ingestion, sometimes called the ordeal of the morsel. You watch as the accused, a nervous miller with flour dust still clinging to his clothes, steps forward. His crime? Someone claims he stole grain, that he skimmed more than his share from the bags he ground. Instead of fiery irons or combat, his fate will be decided by whether he can chew and swallow without choking. It sounds laughable, and you almost do laugh, but then you notice the intensity in the crowd's eyes. No one here doubts that God could make bread stick in a liar's throat. The priest blesses the morsel, tracing the sign of the cross in the air. The miller takes it with trembling hands. You imagine the dry texture of the bread sticking to your tongue, the sharp cheese scratching at your throat. You picture the pressure of the crowd staring, every cough or gag waiting to condemn you. The miller bites, chews slowly, his jaw stiff. You can almost hear the scrape of his teeth in the silence. Then, with an effort, he swallows. The crowd leans forward. Does it go down? Will he choke? He coughs once, and gasps ripple through the hall. A few cry out, "Guilty!" while others hiss for silence. The judge peers intently, and the miller steadies himself, forcing the rest of the bite down. A bead of sweat rolls down his temple, and the hall waits. Finally, the priest nods, declaring that the food has gone down, for now he is innocent. Historians still argue whether people genuinely believed swallowing bread could reveal lies, or whether it was more of a psychological trap. After all, standing before the community, trembling with fear, throat dry as parchment, who wouldn't choke a little? Guilt or not, nerves alone might betray you. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some towns they used not bread and cheese, but consecrated communion wafers, believing that if the holy bread stuck, it was God himself refusing to pass through the body of a liar. In other places, the food was deliberately stale and dry, practically designed to make anyone gag. It was less an ordeal of faith and more a cruel little prank by the authorities. You picture yourself standing there, the bread in your hands. The room is so quiet you can hear the scrape of a chair, the rustle of someone's cloak. Your mouth is dry, your throat feels tight, and suddenly swallowing seems impossible. Imagine the panic of knowing that a single cough might doom you. In that moment, food becomes less nourishment and more a weapon, a verdict disguised as supper. The crowd begins to murmur again as the miller wipes his mouth. Some believe he's been vindicated. Others whisper that his brief cough was a sign of hidden guilt. You realize that no matter the outcome, suspicion lingers. Justice here doesn't wash clean. It leaves a stain, faint but lasting, like flour dust clinging to clothes. The judge dismisses the case, but you can feel the unease in the air. The villagers aren't satisfied, not really. They wanted a spectacle, a collapse, a miracle. Instead, they got a swallow and a cough, ambiguous enough to keep tongues wagging for weeks. And you, standing in the back, can't help but smirk at the absurdity. A man's future decided by a bite of cheese. It would make a terrible cooking show, but here it passes for divine judgment. The miller shuffles back to his seat, pale but relieved, and the table is cleared. You wonder who might be next. What other strange test might be waiting in this hall where justice is never about fairness, but always about theater? And even though you know the bread and cheese ordeal seems silly, you can't shake the chill of imagining it yourself. The dry bite, the choking silence, the collective eyes of your entire community staring, waiting to condemn or absolve you. The court is never quiet for long. As the bread and cheese are swept away, another ritual takes its place. This time, one even stranger. You see the accused, a thin young man with calloused hands, led to the front. He looks bewildered, as though he stumbled into the wrong gathering. A whisper runs through the crowd. He swore an oath falsely. In this world, words are heavy, and breaking an oath is not just lying. It's like poking a hole in the moral fabric of the community. So what's the solution? A bizarre test of voice. The ordeal of speech, sometimes called the ordeal of the blessed words. The priest steps forward holding a slip of parchment, carefully written with verses of Scripture. The accused must recite these lines aloud. If he speaks smoothly with no stumbling, God has cleared him. But if his tongue trips, if his voice catches or cracks, that's divine judgment. Guilty. You can't help but smile at the absurdity. How many times have you tripped over words when you were nervous, even just reading aloud in school? Imagine if every stumble branded you a criminal. The young man clears his throat, and the hall falls silent. He begins to speak, but the words sound heavy in his mouth. His voice quivers. You sense the tension in the air. It's not about the text itself, but whether fear will strangle his tongue. Historians still argue whether these tests were taken literally or whether the community simply used them as an excuse to convict people they already suspected. After all, the line between nerves and guilt is impossible to see. A shaky voice doesn't necessarily mean dishonesty. It just means you're human. But in a medieval courtroom, humanity often worked against you. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some villages, the ordeal wasn't scripture, but a tongue-twister-like chant, deliberately chosen to be difficult. Think of it as a medieval spelling bee with eternal consequences. In fact, one record mentions a man asked to recite the Lord's Prayer backward, a nearly impossible task even if you're innocent, and probably invented by someone who enjoyed a dark joke. The young man stumbles on a word. The crowd gasps. He flushes, trying to recover, but now every syllable feels like a mountain. You can see the panic in his eyes, the sweat gathering at his hairline. He tries again, slower this time, and manages to finish. A murmur spreads. Was his slip just nerves, or was it guilt revealed by God? The judge nods slowly, clearly weighing not the truth, but the impression. Justice here is theater, and the audience is rarely forgiving. You picture yourself in his place, a crowded hall, dozens of eyes on you, the parchment shaking in your hands. Your voice cracks on a syllable, and suddenly you're no longer a person. You're a sinner, a liar, a convict. It's like a bad karaoke night where the stakes are life and death. And you can't help but laugh, quietly, because even in the seriousness of this ritual, it feels like a cosmic prank. The priest closes the book, announcing that the matter is settled. Guilty or innocent, the decision seems less about God and more about how much the community wants to believe in the ritual. Some look satisfied. Others seem disappointed there wasn't a clear sign. For you, though, the lesson is simple. In the Middle Ages, your voice could betray you even when your heart was clean. As the crowd disperses slightly, you lean against the cold stone wall and think back to the miller with his bread and cheese. First your stomach, now your tongue. Every part of the body is a battlefield where truth and lies supposedly fight it out. You wonder what comes next. Maybe your ears, maybe your nose. In this court, no body part seems safe. And though the rituals are absurd, there's something chilling in the way they hold power. The young man walks back, eyes downcast, and the hall prepares for its next strange performance. The hush in the hall lingers for only a heartbeat before the next spectacle begins. A woman is led forward, her eyes red-rimmed, her hands trembling. Her neighbors murmur about a theft, grain gone missing, a few coins slipped away. In a place where survival hangs on every crumb, such accusations weigh heavy. And so, the court prepares another test, one that feels more like a carnival trick than justice. The ordeal of balance. 2 scales are brought out, iron arms squeaking as they're set on a wooden table. At one end sits a Bible, thick and leather-bound, heavy with both weight and meaning. The accused woman is placed gently, almost ceremonially, on the other side. The test is simple. If she outweighs the sacred book, she's innocent. If the Bible proves heavier, the divine verdict is guilt. You lean closer, suppressing a laugh. Imagine walking into your local supermarket and someone weighing you against a stack of cookbooks to decide if you're trustworthy. Yet here, this absurd ritual is cloaked in solemnity. People gather round, craning their necks, watching the scale creak. It tips slightly, then steadies. A tense silence spreads. You can almost hear the collective breath being held. Here's the thing. The Bible was hefty, bound with wood and iron clasps, often weighing more than 10 pounds. Many villagers, especially women underfed by hardship, barely tipped the scale. It sounds unfair, and that's because it was. Historians still argue whether these ordeals were designed as honest attempts at divine judgment, or simply theatrical ways to confirm suspicions already in place, a quirky tidbit. In some towns, the Bible wasn't the chosen weight. Instead, villagers used relics, a saint's bone, a silver chalice, or bizarrely a hunk of salted pork. Nothing like a slab of meat to measure truth. Imagine telling your friends, "Yeah, I was found innocent, because I weighed more than a ham. The woman's frame is thin, her clothes hanging loose, the hunger of long winters etched on her bones. The scale tips toward the Bible, and a ripple of murmurs fills the room. You see her face fall as though gravity itself has betrayed her. To you, sitting in the shadows, it feels less like divine judgment and more like a cruel parody. Yet the ritual has a strange poetry. It suggests a world where morality itself has weight, where truth is something you can measure in pounds and ounces, and while you know it's nonsense, the villagers see it as tangible proof. It reassures them that life's mysteries can be settled by simple mechanics, a balance, a tilt, a verdict. You picture yourself stepping onto that scale. Maybe you've had a heavy dinner and the odds tilt in your favor. Maybe you've skipped too many meals and the book outweighs you. Justice by diet, medieval style. The thought almost makes you chuckle, but the woman's downcast eyes drag you back to the coldness of reality. The judge announces the result. Guilty. The crowd seems satisfied, their hunger for certainty fed for another day. But you notice a few skeptical faces, people whispering under their breath. Maybe they, too, realize how absurd it is. Maybe they know truth can't be measured in iron and parchment. But here, their doubts carry no weight. As the woman is led away, the Bible carefully placed back in its chest, you think of all the other ways people tried to put justice on a scale. Whether it's bread and cheese, trembling voices, or sacred books, each ritual reflects the same desperate desire to make the invisible visible, to drag truth into the open with spectacle. And you realize that in this hall, justice isn't blind. It's heavy, uneven, and creaking like the iron arms of a medieval scale. The next sound that reaches your ears is the slosh of water, the clatter of chains, and the laughter of villagers streaming outside. The trial has ended for the day, but justice in the Middle Ages doesn't always stay in the courtroom. Sometimes it spills into the streets, where punishment becomes a public carnival. And tonight, you follow the crowd toward the village pond, where a wooden contraption waits, the ducking stool. At first glance, it looks almost comical. A heavy wooden chair fastened to the end of a long beam, like some oversized seesaw. But once you see the accused strapped into it, the comedy fades. The woman bound here isn't accused of theft or murder. Her crime is gossip. That's right. Whispering too loudly about neighbors, nagging her husband, or daring to voice opinions earned her a watery sentence. The crowd gathers close, children squealing with delight, adults grinning as though this is free theater. You can almost smell the damp earth and stagnant pond water. With a creak and a shout, the beam tilts, and the woman plunges down, chair and all, into the murky depths. A splash rises, soaking the front row of eager spectators. The stool bobs back up, her hair plastered to her face, her chest heaving, and then down she goes again. It's more than humiliation, it's physical exhaustion. The water chills her bones, the jeers slice at her dignity, and the endless plunging leaves her gasping. Yet to the villagers, this is justice served with entertainment. Historians still argue whether ducking stools were more symbolic than harmful, or whether repeated dunkings led to true injury or even death. Either way, it's clear the line between punishment and spectacle blurred here. A quirky little fact. Some towns reserve ducking stools exclusively for scolds, a term used for women accused of being too loud too argumentative or too opinionated. Men, meanwhile, could yell at taverns all night without consequence. The double standard was baked into the wood of the stool itself. One recorded stool in Canterbury was even fitted with wheels so the scold could be paraded through town before being dunked. A traveling circus of shame. As you watch, you can't help but imagine yourself strapped into that chair. Maybe you once complained that your Wi-Fi was slow or muttered something sharp at the grocery line. Here, that kind of back talk could earn you a soaking in freezing pond water. You joke quietly to yourself, "Guess I'd better keep my mouth shut and my Netflix buffering complaints to myself." But beneath the humor is a chill as deep as the pond itself. The villagers laugh louder with each splash. Children mimic her cries. Adults clap in rhythm with the dunkings. To them, it's both justice and sport, a way of keeping social order with a little side of slapstick. And yet, you sense an undercurrent of fear. Everyone laughs, but everyone also knows speak too freely, stand out too much, and you might be the one strapped in next. The chair rises once more, the woman coughing, shivering, mascara of pond muck streaking her cheeks. She's wheeled back, dripping, humiliated, but alive. Alive. For now. Her punishment ends not with death, but with disgrace, a mark that lingers long after the water has dried. You step back from the crowd, your ears ringing with their cheers. The ducking stool feels less like a tool of justice and more like a mirror, reflecting a society desperate to silence dissenting voices, especially those of women. And though you can smirk at the absurdity, punished for nagging, it's hard not to feel the weight of that chair pressing on your own shoulders. The pond water fades behind you, replaced by the metallic clink of iron being dragged across cobblestones. You follow the sound through narrow alleys until you see a small procession forming. A woman walks at the center, head bowed, her face framed by a grotesque device clamped tightly around her skull. It's called the scold's bridle, or the brank, and it's every bit as uncomfortable as it looks. Picture a heavy iron cage shaped to fit over someone's head, complete with straps that lock beneath the chin. At the front, a jagged plate juts inward, pressing against the tongue. Some versions even had spikes to pierce the flesh if the wearer dared to speak. And because the Middle Ages loved a touch of spectacle, tiny bells often dangled from the top, jingling cheerfully with each humiliating step. Imagine trying to clear your throat with that thing strapped to your face. Yeah, not happening. The crime? Once again, it usually boiled down to being too loud. Gossip, nagging, or simply being outspoken could land you in this iron gag. It wasn't just about silencing you in the moment, it was about branding you as a warning. With the bells ringing and the crowd jeering, everyone knew exactly what you had been accused of. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of being doxxed, except you couldn't mute the notifications, literally. As you walk alongside, you notice the villagers' reactions. Children point and giggle, men smirk, and women exchange uneasy glances. You can almost hear their thoughts. Better her than me. The punishment is designed not just for the wearer, but for the audience. It sends a chilling message. Step out of line, and you too will jingle through the streets with iron cutting into your jaw. A mainstream historical fact. These bridles were used well into the 17th century in England and Scotland, sometimes even in churches, to silence people accused of disrupting sermons. Yes, you could be gagged in iron for whispering too loudly during Sunday service. Historians still argue whether the bridle was always a punishment or sometimes more of a public shaming ritual, since surviving examples are ornately crafted, as if built to be paraded rather than hidden away. Here's a quirky tidbit. One recorded scold's bridle had a tiny carved devil's head perched on the top, as if mocking the wearer for their sins of speech. Another had little animal motifs etched into the iron, almost like some twisted designer label. Imagine bragging, "Oh, mine's the one with the devil horns, limited edition." That's medieval fashion for you. The woman stumbles, the bells chiming pitifully. You catch the metallic tang of rust, the sweat pooling beneath the iron mask, the muffled groans that escape despite the tongue plate pressing down, and you can't help but wince, your modern brain kicking in. This isn't just silencing, it's an early version of controlling narratives, of cutting off voices before they can spread. You imagine yourself with one strapped on for, say, complaining about slow customer service or posting a snarky tweet, bells jingling as you shuffle down the street, neighbors nodding knowingly. There goes the one who dared to complain about the Wi-Fi. It's absurd, and yet the absurdity stings because of how real it once was. By the time the woman is marched out of view, her humiliation is complete. The iron mask has done its job, silenced her, entertained the crowd, and reminded everyone else to keep their tongues in check. Justice in this form isn't about fairness. It's about fear, dressed up as morality, with bells attached. The bells of the iron bridle fade, replaced by the creak of heavy wood and the laughter of a gathered crowd. You find yourself in the town square, where two hulking wooden frames stand tall. These are the pillory and the stocks, the ultimate medieval stage props for turning punishment into public entertainment. At first glance, they almost look like props from a carnival. Wooden beams, holes for heads, hands, or feet. But when you step closer, the reality sets in. Imagine standing locked in place, your chin forced down by the pillory's beam, arms stiff and aching, while the entire town strolls past like it's a free show. Or picture sitting with your ankles trapped in the stocks, legs stretched out awkwardly, your muscles cramping as time drags on. The punishment isn't just the discomfort, it's the performance of shame. The crowd doesn't come empty-handed. A few rotten eggs? Perfect. A handful of mud, spoiled vegetables, or even dung? Even better. The pillory turns into a buffet of ridicule, each passerby feeling licensed to contribute. And if no one throws anything, well, there's always laughter, jeers, or the occasional cruel joke shouted into your ear. You're the headline act, and there's no intermission. Historically, the pillory was used across Europe for centuries, punishing everything from theft to fraud to breaking marketplace rules. One mainstream fact: Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe, was once sentenced to the pillory for political pamphlets. But instead of being pelted with garbage, he was showered with flowers by sympathizers. A rare moment when the crowd flipped the script. Quirky tidbit: in some towns, bakers who cheated customers with underweight loaves were locked up beside their own faulty bread, while onlookers made jokes about half-baked justice. And in the Netherlands, the stocks sometimes had little wooden seats, making them look suspiciously like very uncomfortable benches in a theme park gone wrong. Historians still argue whether the pillory was primarily about pain or spectacle. Being locked in place for hours obviously hurt, but some scholars suggest The deeper wound was social. Your neighbors, customers, even friends witnessed your downfall. Unlike prison, where you vanished from view, the pillory ensured your disgrace became a shared community event. You imagine yourself in those wooden beams, head and hands trapped, staring at someone's boots as they approach. Maybe you brace for the splat of a rotten tomato. Or worse, you flinch as a group of teenagers points and laughs, their mockery louder than any slap. And let's be honest, if this still existed today, half the crowd would probably be live streaming it. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we're pelting my neighbor Dave in the pillory. Don't forget to smash that like button. As you stand there, you notice how the punishment bleeds into performance. The person in the stocks isn't just suffering, they're part of a narrative everyone participates in. One laugh, one jeer, one egg at a time, the community polices itself. You get the sense that medieval justice wasn't about courts tucked away behind stone walls. It was about visible lessons, raw and messy, hammered into the daily rhythm of town life. Hours later, when the wooden beams finally creak open, the prisoner stumbles out, sore, humiliated, but very much changed. And so are you, at least in thought. The stocks and pillory weren't cages, they were mirrors, reflecting what a society thought was worth mocking. The square empties, and you wander down a narrow street where tavern doors swing open, spilling out the scent of ale and the sound of laughter. Tonight, though, the laughter isn't from merrymaking, it's from mockery. You see a man stumbling awkwardly down the cobblestones, and at first you think he's simply too drunk to walk straight. Then you notice the strange wooden contraption strapped to him. He's wearing a barrel. Literally. His arms poke through two rough holes on the sides, his head juts through the top, and the base scrapes along his knees as he shuffles forward like a trapped turtle. This is the drunkard's cloak, one of the strangest punishments you've ever seen. It looks ridiculous, and that's the point. You can almost hear the medieval judge chuckling when they came up with it. So, you enjoyed drowning yourself in beer? Fine. Let's make you wear your barrel next time. And sure enough, here's this poor fellow waddling around like a walking ale cask while townsfolk follow behind, laughing, pointing, and occasionally tossing him a mock toast with their mugs. Historically, the drunkard's cloak was popular in Germany, the Netherlands, and England. Mainstream fact, one record from Newcastle upon Tyne in the 17th century describes men being forced into these heavy barrels and paraded through town as a warning to anyone who couldn't hold their drink. The humiliation was worse than the physical burden. The quirky detail? Sometimes the cloak wasn't even an actual barrel. In some villages, it was just a big wooden tub with holes cut out, strapped on with ropes. Imagine trying to walk in that. You'd waddle like a penguin while everyone around you pretends not to die of laughter. Oh, and occasionally they'd even paint slogans or crude drawings on the barrel, so you became a literal walking billboard of shame. Historians still argue whether punishments like this were meant to curb drunkenness or simply provide free entertainment. After all, in an era when taverns were basically the center of nightlife, being a little too merry wasn't exactly unusual. Was the cloak about reforming behavior, or was it just another way for sober neighbors to feel smug? You picture yourself inside one of those barrels. It's heavy. It smells of stale beer, and your arms are jammed awkwardly at your sides. You shuffle along, trying not to trip, while children run circles around you, singing songs about old drunk Jack and his walking cask. The humiliation burns hotter than any hangover. And to make it worse, you know this isn't a private punishment. It's designed for maximum visibility. The longer you walk, the more people see, and the longer the memory sticks. And let's be honest, if this existed today, college towns would probably turn it into a paid tourist attraction. Come experience medieval justice. Step inside the drunkard's cloak for only $9.99. Half the participants would post selfies inside, hashtagging CaskWalk like it's some new TikTok challenge. As you watch the man wobble further down the road, you notice something else. The drunkard's cloak doesn't just humiliate the person inside, it creates a bond for the crowd. Everyone gets to laugh together, share in the spectacle, and confirm, at least for tonight, that they're not the one inside the barrel. It's a reminder that medieval justice wasn't always bloody or cruel. Sometimes it was just awkward, heavy, and loud enough to leave your dignity rolling behind you on the cobblestones. The laughter fades behind you, and soon the cobbled road opens into a stark clearing outside the city walls. The air here feels heavier, like the stones themselves remember what has happened. You see it before you hear it. A massive wooden wheel propped upright, its spokes wide and waiting. A crowd gathers at a distance, hushed now, their mirth from earlier spectacles replaced with a tense silence. You recognize this at once, the dreaded breaking wheel. Your stomach turns just watching. The condemned is led out, wrists bound, face pale but strangely resigned. He's laid across the wheel like some unfortunate puppet, arms and legs stretched out across the spokes. Then the executioner lifts a heavy iron bar, raises it above his head, and brings it down. The crack echoes, not the wheel's wood, but bone giving way. The crowd gasps, then murmurs, but they don't turn away. No one ever turns away. Mainstream history fact. The breaking wheel was one of the harshest punishments in Europe, used from the Middle Ages into the 18th century. It wasn't just about execution. It was about prolonging suffering and sending a message. Victims might be left broken but alive, tied to the wheel and raised on a post, left for days, until death finally claimed them. The quirky detail? Some towns added a touch of customization. In parts of France, executioners were known to strategically break limbs so the body could be woven between the spokes, twisted into grotesque shapes like a macabre sculpture. It wasn't just punishment, it was performance art with bones as brushstrokes. Historians still argue whether the wheel was more about religious symbolism or public intimidation. Some point to the turning as a metaphor for divine justice, while others say it was purely about fear. After all, a single execution could silence an entire village. You shift uncomfortably as you imagine lying across those spokes yourself. The cold wood digs into your back. Your breath quickens as the shadow of the bar hovers above. Each strike sends pain rippling, and the world becomes only sound. The whistle of iron, the splintering of bone, the collective gasp of the audience. And when it's finally done, you're not hidden away. You're hoisted high on display, the wheel turning slowly in the wind, your body a grim billboard warning others what disobedience costs. And here's the strangest part. People brought food and blankets, making a day of it. Families picnicked nearby, children played at the edges, and vendors sold roasted chestnuts while someone's father dangled broken-limbed above. It was theater, justice, and carnival rolled into one. Now, imagine if the breaking wheel existed today. Somewhere, a theme park would market it as medieval mayhem, offering a safe version with rubber bars and sound effects. And you just know someone would ruin the mood by live streaming. Yo guys, smash that like button if you think I'd survive 10 minutes on this wheel. But here in this clearing, there's no modern filter, no way to soften the horror. The crowd stares silently as the condemned man's body is wound into the wheel, limbs bent like branches in a storm. The wheel creaks, birds circle above, and justice, at least in medieval eyes, has been served. You can't help but glance back once more as you leave. The silhouette of the wheel burned into your memory. It looms like a clock stopped forever at the hour of pain, reminding you that in this era, justice wasn't blind. It was brutally, theatrically visible. The road bends and carries you toward the city gates. The smell hits you before the sight, an acrid mix of iron, rot, and damp straw. Above the gatehouse, something swings gently in the breeze. At first you think it's a scarecrow, some farmer's lost puppet, until you step closer and realize it's no doll. It's a man, or what's left of him, suspended inside a narrow iron cage. His arms dangle through the bars, head slumped forward, skin drawn tight over bone. The cage sways with the wind, squeaking faintly like a rusty weather vane. This is the gibbet cage, a punishment as much about what happens after death as before it. The body inside is not buried, not honored, not hidden. Instead, it is put on display, hanging over the road, so every traveler, merchant, and farmer sees the warning. This is what happens to criminals. The punishment doesn't end with the execution. It lingers, visible, day after day, until nothing but bones remain. The mainstream historical fact is clear. Gibbeting was common in parts of Europe, and especially notorious in England, between the 16th and 18th centuries. Pirates, highwaymen, and murderers often ended up like this, swinging in iron cages on cliffs or at crossroads. The idea wasn't about torture anymore. It was about deterrence, keeping crime literally rotting in the public eye. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some gibbets were made custom fit, ironwork shaped to the body like a grotesque suit of armor. In certain cases, executioners left peepholes in the chest or face so birds could feast more easily. Ravens, crows, even stray cats came to feed, turning the gibbet into a gruesome buffet line. Local children sometimes dared each other to run under the cage at night, as if the ghost of the condemned might reach out with skeletal fingers. Historians still argue whether gibbeting actually reduced crime. Did people really avoid highway robbery because of a swinging corpse, or was it just a state-sponsored scare tactic? Some suggest the spectacle may have hardened people, normalizing cruelty instead of preventing it. You imagine what it's like to be that unfortunate soul. The trial has already condemned you, the execution finished. But instead of rest, your body is carted through town, clanging in its iron suit. Crowds gather not to mourn, but to gawk, their whispers burning more than any flame. Days turn into weeks as your remains dry and crumble. You're no longer a person. You're an eternal warning sign. Of course, if this existed today, you'd probably see it on postcards. Visit historic Gibbet Hill, where justice swings forever. Some influencer would set up a tripod. Hey fam, back at it again with medieval vibes. Don't forget to smash subscribe before the crow does. A morbid selfie opportunity, complete with Raven filter. But back then, it wasn't ironic. The gibbet was a constant reminder not just of one man's crime, but of power. who held it, and how far they'd go to enforce it. You glance upward once more as the cage creaks. The skull seems to tilt just slightly, as though even in death the condemned is watching you pass. The iron rattles in the wind, and you step quickly beneath the gate, half expecting the bones to fall at your feet. Behind you, the cage fades into the distance, a swinging metronome marking time in a world where justice hung heavy in the air, literally. The road winds on, but the air does not clear. It thickens, taking on a strange dampness, almost like walking into a cellar. Before long, you hear the muffled roar of water below the ground. You step toward a wooden platform near the riverbank and see what looks at first like an oversized seesaw. At one end, a sturdy chair, bolted with iron straps. At the other, a long counterweight designed to tip and plunge, and then you realize you're staring at a ducking stool. This contraption had one purpose: to test, punish, and humiliate, usually women accused of gossip, scolding, or worse, witchcraft. A woman would be bound into the chair and swung out over the water. With a sudden release, the whole seat tipped, plunging her under. The crowd gathered to cheer or jeer while she struggled to hold her breath. Pulled up gasping, she might be plunged again and again until exhaustion took her. The mainstream historical fact is that ducking stools were common in England and colonial America, especially during the 16th and 17th centuries. They weren't always fatal. Sometimes the idea was humiliation more than death. But for those accused of witchcraft, the logic became twisted. If you floated, you were guilty. If you drowned, you were innocent. Yes, it's the kind of justice where you probably won't survive either way. A quirky tidbit. Some towns treated the ducking stool almost like a festival attraction. In certain places, people scheduled duckings on market days, ensuring the maximum audience. The condemned didn't just face water, but ridicule. Ballads and crude rhymes were shouted, mocking her as she spluttered. In one infamous case, records mention that onlookers sold refreshments during the spectacle as if cruelty were best enjoyed with a meat pie in hand. Historians still argue whether ducking was truly intended to uncover truth or if it was really about control, silencing women in a society terrified of outspoken voices. Was the stool a test of morality or just an excuse to shame and scare? Some scholars suggest it wasn't only about witchcraft, but about reinforcing rigid gender expectations. You picture yourself dragged to the platform. The rope cuts into your wrists, your body bound tight. The crowd buzzes like a swarm of bees, children climbing up barrels for a better view. The chair tilts, and suddenly, splash! Cold water surges around you, filling your nose and mouth. The world becomes muffled and frantic, a blur of bubbles and panic. Before you can scream, you're yanked upward, coughing, only to hear laughter instead of mercy. The chair jerks again, and down you go, swallowed by water once more. If this were modern day, you can bet there would be a ducking challenge trending on TikTok. People would film themselves falling backward into pools with captions like "medieval vibes only." Someone would sell inflatable ducking stools as pool toys, and a theme park would brand it the Witch Dip Experience, with waterproof merch available at the gift shop. Humanity has a way of commercializing even its darkest past. But in the Middle Ages, there was no irony, just the cold water, the jeering crowd, and the terrifying realization that your life depended on rules that made no sense. Whether you survived or not, the town walked away reminded of who held power and how quickly it could dunk you into oblivion. You step back from the platform shivering despite being dry. The river flows on, carrying whispers of those who sank beneath its surface, their voices lost in bubbles, but never entirely gone. Somewhere in that water, centuries later, the echo of laughter and splashing still lingers, reminding you that justice was often as shallow and merciless as the stream it played out in. The scent of wet wood and river mud lingers as you move along the embankment, and soon the noise of the crowd fades into an eerie quiet. You find yourself at a small stone bridge, and underneath it, a shallow pit has been dug. The condemned is already there, kneeling with chains clinking against the damp earth. This is the ordeal by water, not quite the ducking stool, but equally bizarre and terrifying. Here, the accused, usually someone suspected of witchcraft or heresy, is bound and thrown into a pond or river. The belief? If they float, it's a sign of guilt. If they sink, innocence. Absurd, isn't it? Floating, a natural reaction for many, marks you as a sinner. Sinking, often fatal, could prove you were pure. It's an execution disguised as a test. Mainstream historical fact. Ordeals by water were practiced in parts of Europe through the 15th and 16th centuries. In England, it was even formalized under certain municipal laws. The accused would sometimes be bound with heavy weights to ensure a fair test, though fairness here is relative. Historians still argue whether the floating-sinking rule was taken literally or served more as a pretext for judgment already decided. Quirky tidbit. Some communities added flavor to the ordeal by throwing in pigs or ducks into the water to test the accused's ability to stay afloat. One account from Germany mentions a man who, accused of sorcery, was dunked repeatedly until a local shoemaker tied a rope to rescue him mid-test. Talk about a medieval intervention. You watch the condemned struggle, feeling the tug of the current and the weight of the chains. His legs flail as water laps at his chin, and you notice the subtle panic in his eyes. Around you, villagers are silent, tense. This isn't mere entertainment. Every splash, every gasp counts. And yet, there's a strange theatricality to it, a choreography of terror that seems almost choreographed, as though the river itself were part of the court. Imagine being thrown into that pit. The cold bites, the rope burns against your wrists, and panic mixes with absurdity. If I sink, I die. If I float, I'm a witch. Great, this makes total sense. You try to fight the water, but instinct keeps you buoyant, proving guilt when all you wanted was to survive. The irony is bitter. In today's world, this might become a viral prank. Floating or guilty? Medieval dunking challenge. Except now, your audience doesn't fear divine judgment. They're just waiting for the blooper reel. Back then, though, the stakes were brutally tangible. Your survival, your reputation, even your life depended on whims, superstition, and physics. Finally, the priest signals. The accused is dragged out, waterlogged, exhausted, and gasping. Whether guilty or innocent, the ordeal leaves its mark. Soaked to the bone, terrified, humiliated. You can't help but shiver, thinking of the centuries where this was standard legal procedure. In the Middle Ages, water wasn't just a life-giving element. It could be a judge, jury, and executioner all at once. The river's murmur fades as you continue along the winding path, and soon you notice a small wooden platform built into the side of a hill. At first glance, it looks like a stage, but the ropes dangling from above tell a different story. A man stands there blindfolded, his hands bound behind his back. This is the gallows, the classic instrument of execution. Yet even here, medieval justice adds layers of peculiarity that modern eyes can scarcely imagine. You might think hanging is straightforward, a rope, a platform, and gravity. But in the Middle Ages, there were elaborate variations. Some gallows were designed with a trap door that released suddenly, dropping the condemned with a terrifying jolt intended to break the neck instantly. Others were simply platforms where the victim strangled slowly, suspended for all to witness, their struggles marking time for the crowd. There was little consistency. Justice was improvisation in wood, rope, and fear. Mainstream historical fact, hanging was the most common form of capital punishment in England and much of Europe from the 12th century onward. It was public, deliberate, and often meant as deterrence. Yet historians still argue whether some hangings were designed more for prolonged suffering or merely spectacle. How much was justice, and how much was social theater? A quirky tidbit: in some towns, the condemned were dressed in their best clothing or even in ceremonial robes. The idea was that, at least in death, one would appear presentable while serving as a moral lesson. One record mentions a man hanged in a full wedding suit, leaving onlookers whispering both in horror and fascination. Did he plan this, or was he just unlucky? You notice the crowd gathering. Some lean forward, eager for the drop. Children peek from behind barrels, curiosity outweighing fear. You can almost smell the mix of sweat, mud, and rope fibers. The executioner checks the knot, adjusts the rope, and steps back. There's a strange rhythm to it, like a macabre dance. The condemned sways lightly, a prelude to the final movement. Imagine being that person. You stand on the wooden platform, blindfold over your eyes, listening to the whispers, the shuffling of feet, the muted sobs of someone you'll never know. Your mind races through a million scenarios, some practical, some absurd. Maybe I'll land in the bushes and survive. Maybe the rope will snap. Maybe I should have taken up fishing instead of, well, whatever landed me here. The trapdoor swings open, and gravity does its work. There's a brief, terrifying sensation of freefall, followed by a sudden jerk. The crowd gasps, some cheer, some turn away, unable to watch the aftermath. You notice how even the most brutal acts are framed by ritual, the positioning of the rope, the timing of the drop, the exact moment of death meant to communicate moral authority. In modern imagination, this would be a horror show. On the streets of the Middle Ages, it was education, deterrence, and spectacle combined. And as you walk away, the echo of the rope snapping against the wooden platform lingers in your mind. A grim reminder that even seemingly simple punishments were layered with ritual, intent, and a flair for theatricality. The gallows disappear behind you as you move toward a quieter part of the village, where the scent of straw and smoke mixes with the faint tang of iron. Here, punishment takes a different, almost theatrical turn. You see a man kneeling, bound, and an array of long, narrow spikes arranged above him. This is the torture of the Judas cradle, a device so strange and sinister that even imagining it makes your skin prickle. A wooden pyramid is the centerpiece, narrow and pointed, designed to impale, but not fatally, at least not immediately. The condemned is slowly lowered onto the tip, the weight of the body stretching and twisting in agonizing positions. Unlike the gallows, which are public and swift, or at least dramatic, this is drawn out, forcing prolonged discomfort. The idea was to extract confessions, punish blasphemy, or break a person's will while giving the spectators a morally charged, almost educational show. Mainstream historical fact. The Judas cradle and similar devices were used in parts of Spain and Italy during the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance. Torture was officially sanctioned under certain laws as a method of interrogation, though it was not universal. Historians still argue how often these devices were actually lethal versus performative, a demonstration of authority rather than a true execution. Quirky tidbit. Some townsfolk decorated the top of the pyramid with carvings of devils, saints, or grotesque faces, almost like a twisted Christmas tree topper. In one documented case, the victim's feet were placed in stirrups, and a pulley system slowly lifted the body, creating an almost pendulum-like motion. You can't help but imagine the absurdity of being swung like a marionette while everyone takes notes on your discomfort. The crowd, subdued yet fascinated, whispers among themselves. Children peek from behind barrels, mimicking the motions with sticks and play unaware of the gravity. Adults nod knowingly, some shudder, some discuss morality. It's less a spectacle of violence than a live demonstration of power and submission. You notice the subtle cues, how the executioner controls pace, how ropes creak in rhythm, how the victim's muffled groans punctuate the silence. Imagine yourself there. The pyramid presses beneath you, your body stretches in unnatural angles, and every shift sends sharp reminders of gravity and imbalance. Breathing becomes a conscious act. Sweat pours despite the chill. You wonder if anyone has ever laughed at the absurdity in the moment, or if even humor was drowned in the weight of fear. In a modern twist, you can picture someone turning this into an escape room attraction. Can you survive the Judas Cradle challenge? Complete with padding, safety checks, and live commentary. But back then, there were no safeguards, just design, intent, and the relentless eye of authority. As the victim is eventually lifted and freed, the crowd exhales collectively. Relief, satisfaction, or simply curiosity quenched. They've witnessed another demonstration of power, and you, walking away, can't shake the combination of fascination and horror, realizing that in the Middle Ages, justice and theater were inseparable, each act meticulously crafted to instruct, humiliate, and impress. The echoes of the Judas Cradle fade as you make your way to the town's outskirts, where the air grows colder and the forest edges loom. Here, the punishments take on a ritualistic tone. You stumble upon a clearing, and in the center stands a wooden frame shaped like a giant gex. A man is tied, spread eagle, arms and legs stretched and fastened to the corners. This is the infamous strappato, a method of suspension designed to inflict excruciating pain without spilling blood. You notice immediately how delicate yet cruel the mechanism is. A rope is tied to the wrists, passed through a pulley overhead. When the executioner pulls, the victim is hoisted into the air, hanging by the arms. The shoulders tear under the strain, muscles and joints screaming under the sudden weight. Sometimes, weights were added to the ankles to intensify the agony. Unlike other punishments, this one doesn't just humiliate. It torments physically while keeping the condemned fully conscious. Mainstream historical fact. Strappado was widely used across Europe, particularly in Italy, Spain, and Germany, from the 14th to 17th centuries. It was considered a method of interrogation as much as punishment. Historians still argue whether it was meant to extract confessions or purely intimidate communities through fear of visible torture. A quirky tidbit: in some towns, executioners developed elaborate swing patterns, jerking the victim up and down or rotating them slightly, almost like a twisted dance, to prolong suffering while adding a rhythmic spectacle for the crowd. One account even mentions onlookers betting on how many swings it would take before the victim could no longer endure the pain. The crowd watches silently at first, then murmurs as the man struggles. You can almost smell the sweat and leather of the ropes, hear the creak of pulleys, and feel the tension in the air. The executioner manipulates the ropes with precision, each lift calculated. You can't help but imagine yourself there, wrists pulled above your head, muscles tearing, every second an eternity. Historians still debate the psychological effects of strappado. Did it break spirits more than bones? Did public witnessing create social obedience? You notice how even those merely watching are affected. Shivers run down spines, whispers tighten lips, laughter is scarce. Fear spreads as efficiently as pain. A modern observer might liken this to extreme gym torture, a sadistic version of a pull-up challenge where failure means agony instead of embarrassment. The absurdity and cruelty merge seamlessly, creating a lesson as unforgettable as it is horrifying. As the man is finally lowered, exhausted and trembling, the crowd exhales, some with relief, some with grim satisfaction. Another display complete, another demonstration of control, power, and public spectacle. And you, stepping away into the shadowed woods, feel the lingering tension, the reminder that in medieval times punishment was not just about retribution, it was performance, theater, and terror rolled into one. The shadows of the forest stretch long as you stumble onto a quiet village square, eerily empty now. At the center, a peculiar device captures your attention. A long iron collar attached to a heavy post, chains dangling from its sides. The neck restraint glints in the dim light, and you realize, with a shiver, this is the medieval jougs, a punishment designed for control and public humiliation rather than outright death. The condemned would be fastened by the neck, often with hands also secured to prevent escape. Once chained, the person was forced to remain in place for hours or even days. Passers-by could taunt, throw refuse, or shout insults without fear of retaliation. The jogs were often placed outside churches, taverns, or town halls, ensuring maximum exposure. The intent was clear. Anyone daring to disrupt social order would face shame on a highly visible stage. Mainstream historical fact: jougs were common in Scotland and northern England from the 16th to 18th centuries. They were primarily used for minor offenses such as drunkenness, gossip, or petty theft. Historians still argue whether jougs were intended more for deterrence or public humiliation. The line between the two often blurred. A quirky tidbit: some jougs had tiny iron bells attached to the chains, jingling with every slight movement. Imagine shuffling, wobbling, or nodding as the bells announce your discomfort to the world. One town reportedly had a wooden platform built beneath the jougs so the victim's feet wouldn't touch mud, making it even more awkward for photos. Well, if medieval towns had cameras, you imagine yourself in those chains, neck pressed against cold iron, head forced forward, the crowd's whispers, the slap of shoes on cobblestone, even the clink of coins thrown mockingly at your feet. It all becomes a rhythm of shame you cannot escape. It's not painful in the immediate sense, but the discomfort, combined with relentless scrutiny, gnaws at your nerves like termites on wood. In a modern twist, the jogs might become a viral sensation. Social media posts would abound. His jugs challenge, people daring friends to endure the bells, the standing, the humiliation, all in a sanitized and safe version, of course. But in the Middle Ages, there were no filters, no witty captions, just enduring exposure and the silent, judgmental gaze of your neighbors. As the day stretches on, you watch the town adjust to the presence of the chained figure. Merchants continue trading, children play nearby, and the clock ticks on. You realize the brilliance and cruelty of the jogs. Punishment had become normalized, a part of daily life, visible in every passing glance. You step back, taking a deep breath of the cool evening air, and note the final lesson of medieval justice. Sometimes the slow burn of humiliation is more effective and more memorable than the swiftest blade or iron spike. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've traveled through river plunges, iron cages, wheels, and pulleys, witnessing the creative extremes of human ingenuity in the name of law. Remember, while history may chill, it also fascinates, offering glimpses into a world where justice, theater, and fear dance together in ways you'll never forget. As the night settles, let the images fade gently from your mind. The cobblestones, the iron, the river, and the wheels are distant now, softened by the calm rhythm of your breath. You can feel the cold of the water and the weight of chains dissolve, replaced by warmth in your room. The steady hum of the fan a lullaby against the echoes of history. None of the bells, barrels, or spikes linger here. They exist only as lessons and stories, shadows of a time that is fascinating yet thankfully behind us. You might notice a lingering shiver when imagining the branks, the pillories, and the ducking stools, but let it remind you of resilience, both human and communal. The medieval world was inventive, relentless, and sometimes absurd, but through understanding it, you gain perspective on justice, compassion, and humanity's capacity for both cruelty and curiosity. Let your mind wander to safer, gentler images now. The flowing river without a ducking stool, the empty gallows swinging softly in the wind, the iron cages resting silent and cold. Imagine stepping away from the spectacle, your heartbeat slowing, the distant past fading into the quiet of your room. Allow the stories of punishment to become distant echoes, replaced by the comfort of your bed, the softness of sheets, and the gentle assurance that these extremes belong only to history. You survived this journey. You've glimpsed a world of imagination, fear, and ritual, and now it's time to let your own world reclaim your thoughts. Close your eyes. Let the clink of iron, the creak of wood, and the rush of water fade into memory. Tonight, you've walked among history's most creative, strange, and terrifying punishments. Let that knowledge settle, soft and distant, while sleep takes over, carrying you gently into your own safe, quiet story. End of script. Sweet dreams. If you still can't sleep, Don't worry, we'll still be with you tonight. Let's go to story 2 together. Hey guys, tonight we step into the cobbled streets of a medieval town where shadows stretch long and the air smells of smoke, horse sweat, and something you can't quite identify. Probably a mix of unwashed wool and fear. You trudge past merchants shouting over the clatter of carts, past children playing with sticks that double as swords, and then your eyes settle on something unexpected. A wooden frame stands in the square, ropes dangling, chains clinking, and a small crowd gathered around, murmuring, pointing, and occasionally laughing. This is where justice isn't blind, it's loud, public, and occasionally absurd, and you probably won't survive this, at least not in spirit. Before you get too deep into imagining medieval terror, a quick reality check. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, leave your location and local time in the comments. It's fun to see who's listening while the sun rises, sets, or the night deepens. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first spectacle you notice is the pillory, a wooden frame with holes for the head and hands, designed not to kill but to humiliate. You imagine the person's cheeks pressed against splintered wood, townsfolk pointing, laughing, sometimes tossing rotten fruit. Mainstream historians note that pillories were a staple of European justice, used for everything from minor theft to quarrelsome behavior. Quirkily, some towns added bells or whistles to make the punishment theatrical, turning a crime into a performance. Historians still argue whether the pillory's main goal was deterrence or simple entertainment, though the discomfort and embarrassment are undeniable. Children at the edge of the crowd mimic the positions, laughing while elders scold them for curiosity. You notice small details: a loose rope, a fly buzzing persistently, the sound of wood creaking under weight. The pillory is a stage, every face in the crowd an actor, and the condemned unwittingly both star and cautionary tale. Even here, justice carries layers. There are whispers of bribes to shorten time in the pillory, and some clever tricksters would wear padding or hidden shoes to ease the agony. You imagine someone today trying that, documenting Life Hacks Medieval Edition, while the audience gasped and giggles. But back then, these were real high-stakes games where humiliation could ripple through your reputation for life. From the square, you hear the market continue. Carts rolling, haggling, birds squawking. Life goes on, indifferent to your suffering. And in that stark juxtaposition, pain and normalcy, you feel the essence of medieval punishment. Not just physical, but psychological, woven into daily life, observed, absorbed, and remembered by everyone who passes by. You step away from the pillory, but the echo of splintered wood and muffled grunts lingers in your mind. Just down the lane, a set of stocks catches your eye. Unlike the pillory designed to trap head and hands, the stocks imprison only the feet, sometimes both feet and hands, leaving the rest of the body awkwardly exposed. You watch as a young man wiggles futilely, his ankles secured in the oak clamps, unable to escape, while townsfolk jeer, toss scraps of food, and occasionally deliver a playful kick. The smell of spilled ale and trampled straw mingles with the air. It's a sensory overload, part punishment, part carnival. Historically, Stocks were used to punish minor offenses. Drunkenness, petty theft, and insolence were common reasons. The mainstream fact is clear. Their purpose was primarily public humiliation, not long-term harm, although blisters, bruises, and chafed skin were almost inevitable. Some towns even maintained a dedicated stock square, where the same offenders could be displayed repeatedly, the oak clamps acting as both deterrent and reminder that no one escapes scrutiny. Historians still argue whether the threat of discomfort or the fear of ridicule was more effective in maintaining social order. Here's a quirky detail. In certain regions, jars of water, mud, or even animal dung were poured over the trapped feet, adding both disgust and comic effect. In one account, a local tailor placed a small bell on the stocks. Each wiggle jingled merrily, turning punishment into a grotesque musical performance. You can imagine children laughing, mimicking the sound, while adults grimace at the added indignity. It's punishment and entertainment rolled into one splintered package. The psychological weight is palpable. You can picture yourself kneeling there, legs pinned, unable to shift comfortably. The chatter of the crowd piercing every attempt at mental escape. Each foot tap against the wooden block reminds you that nothing in this society escapes scrutiny, no matter how small or ridiculous the crime. The stocks may seem quaint, almost whimsical, from a modern distance, but they carry a bite that lingers, teaching conformity through shame rather than physical torment. You notice subtle signs of human ingenuity, too. A few clever souls would prop cushions or fold cloth to reduce pain, while more rebellious spirits dared to taunt passers-by with jokes, turning their punishment into performance art. And yet, the crowd's approval or scorn dictated whether these acts were harmless or dangerously provocative. As the sun dips, shadows stretch across the cobblestones, and the sounds of market life continue around you. The man in the stocks shifts again, jostled by both discomfort and ridicule, while you move on, carrying with you the lesson that medieval punishment was rarely private, often performative, and always socially instructive, blending pain with spectacle and personal shame with public theater. You wander further, the street narrowing as the market noise fades into the background. Here, something that seems almost absurd catches your eye. A barrel, yes, a full-sized wooden barrel, standing upright with holes for arms, head, and sometimes even legs. This is the infamous drunkard's cloak, a device used to punish those guilty of public drunkenness or minor misbehavior. The condemned is hoisted into it, the stench of ale sometimes clinging to their clothes, and paraded through the streets. You probably won't survive the indignity if it were you. Well, at least not without embarrassment. Historically, the drunkard's cloak was popular in England and parts of northern Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries. Its purpose was as much about public humiliation as it was correction. You could be left standing in the village square for hours, the crowd laughing at every wobble and stumble, perhaps tossing vegetables or mud to heighten your shame. Historians still argue whether these punishments truly corrected behavior or simply reinforced social hierarchies by making an example out of the weak or marginalized. A quirky tidbit: in some towns, barrels were decorated with painted faces or horns, transforming the wearer into a human caricature. Children would chase the walking barrel through the streets, laughing and poking, turning what was meant to be a lesson into a chaotic carnival game. In one anecdote, A particularly nimble man managed to tilt his barrel sideways, causing a brief but hilarious domino effect with other barrels left in the square. You imagine stepping into that barrel yourself, the wood pressing uncomfortably against your torso, arms pinned, head stuck in a hole just wide enough to see the world. Every jostle sends you wobbling unsteadily on cobblestones, and the mockery of the crowd is relentless. The smell of sweat, ale, and wood mingles, a sensory reminder that the world is watching your every awkward move. Even today, you can picture a modern reenactment video. Someone waddling in a barrel for a TikTok challenge, medieval barrel wobble. Except back then, there were no filters, no edits, no pause button. The shame was immediate, unrelenting, and fully social. And that's the genius or cruelty of the drunkard's cloak. It made every minor misstep a spectacle, a lesson both for the individual and the community. The crowd eventually disperses, leaving the barrel behind, wobbling slightly on the cobblestones. The lesson lingers. In the medieval mind, humor and punishment were intertwined, and embarrassment was a currency as effective as iron or chains. You step away, realizing that in this world, every glance counts, every public error magnified, and every barrel wearer remembered long after the parade ends. As you leave the wobbling barrels behind, the street opens into a small square, where a low murmur rises to a tense hum. Here, a different kind of punishment awaits. The branks, also called the scold's bridle. You spot a woman seated on a bench, iron straps locked around her head, a gag pressing her tongue flat, small bells jingling with every tilt of her head. The air carries a metallic tang, the smell of rust and leather blending oddly with nearby bakeries. You probably wouldn't survive the humiliation if you were in her place, but you can't look away. Historically, the branks were used across England and parts of Scotland, primarily to punish women accused of gossiping, nagging, or otherwise disturbing social order. Mainstream historians note that the device could be worn for hours or even days, effectively silencing the wearer and turning them into a mobile spectacle. Historians still argue whether the branks were primarily a tool of gendered control or a genuine effort to curb public disturbance. Either way, the psychological weight was immense. A quirky tidbit: some branks were elaborately decorated with engraved faces, bells, or horns to amplify ridicule. In one recorded case, a particularly clever woman managed to jingle the bells rhythmically, creating a sort of unintended street music while enduring her punishment. The audience found it both entertaining and aggravating, proof that even in punishment, personality could shine through. You imagine stepping into that iron cage, your head pressed uncomfortably, tongue flattened beneath metal, eyes scanning the faces that circle you. Every tilt triggers a bell, every breath a jolt of awareness. The world is watching, judging, laughing. You're forced into hyper-awareness, a constant mental gymnastics that twists the mind, even as the body remains restrained. In modern terms, this could be a viral prank. The Scold Challenge: can you survive the bells and the gawking? Except in medieval times, there were no safety nets, no laughs edited out. Humiliation was total and irreversible. The branks were less about physical pain and more about social control, reinforcing norms through spectacle. Finally, the crowd disperses, leaving behind only jingling echoes and the faint scent of iron. You step back, shivering despite the warmth of the day, realizing that medieval punishments were as much about controlling minds as restraining bodies. Public humiliation Creativity and cruelty and a perverse sense of theater were intertwined, leaving lasting impressions on both victim and observer alike. The jingling echoes fade as you move further down the uneven cobblestones, and soon you see something that makes you wince. A cucking stool or ducking stool perched by the edge of a small canal. A woman is seated on the wooden contraption, straps securing her to the chair, her feet dangling above the murky water. The executioner leans forward, adjusting the ropes and pulleys, preparing for the first dip. The air smells of damp wood, river mud, and something less definable, a faint whiff of fear. You probably wouldn't survive the embarrassment if you were the one in the chair, but the spectacle is magnetic. Historically, ducking stools were used in England and parts of Europe to punish scolds, women accused of gossiping or minor public misbehavior. Mainstream records show that repeated plunges into the water were common, both to physically discomfort and publicly humiliate. Historians still argue whether these punishments were actually effective at controlling behavior, or if they were primarily intended to entertain townsfolk and reinforce gender hierarchies. A quirky tidbit: in some towns, children would follow the chair, tossing water or mud in playful imitation, turning the punishment into a chaotic, carnival-like scene. One account even mentions a victim who managed to kick off her shoes, causing them to float downstream and sparking laughter among the crowd. Brief moments of agency within an otherwise oppressive ritual. You imagine sitting in that chair, heart pounding, toes skimming the water, the crowd jeering, children pointing, and the rope suddenly tugging you under. The cold bite of the river shocks the body, sending shivers up your spine, while humiliation presses heavily on your chest. Each dip is an endurance test, a performance, and a lesson wrapped in public spectacle. The psychological weight is as potent as the physical. Dangling helpless with every splash observed, your mind oscillates between panic, disbelief, and an absurd sort of humor. You notice the subtleties, the squeak of the chair's wood, the creak of the pulley, the faint ripple of water as it slaps against the canal walls. Even small details amplify the drama. In modern imagination, this might become a challenge video. Ducking challenge, padded seats, edited clips, safe splashes. But in the Middle Ages, there were no edits, no outtakes. Every splash, every gasp, every chuckle was real and unfiltered. The cucking stool reminds you that punishment was often performative, a blend of fear, theater, and communal reinforcement, teaching lessons not just to the victim, but to the entire village. As the woman is lifted from the water, gasping, shivering, and humiliated, the crowd slowly disperses. You step back, reflecting on how even a simple river dip could embody control, creativity, and social theater all at once. Medieval justice was rarely about subtlety. It was crafted to be memorable, immersive, and utterly impossible to ignore. The wet echoes of the canal fade as you follow the narrow street toward the marketplace once more. Here, you encounter another variant of the ducking ritual, this time in a more theatrical, almost festival-like setting. A wooden chair is mounted on a pivoting beam over a wider pond, and a man or woman, often accused of gossip, nagging, or public insolence, is strapped in place. Townsfolk gather in clusters, laughter and chatter mixing with the occasional gasp as the executioner tilts the chair, sending the victim splashing into the water below. The stench of mud and fish rises, mingling with the aroma of nearby bread stalls. You probably wouldn't survive the humiliation without wincing, yet you can't look away. Historically, ducking stools and their variants were a common sight across England and parts of northern Europe from the 15th to 17th centuries. Their purpose was to publicly discipline minor offenders, particularly women labeled as scolds or nags. Historians still argue whether the primary intent was correction or community entertainment. Either way, social norms were reinforced through public spectacle. A quirky tidbit: in some towns, the ducking would be repeated multiple times, and mischievous children would time the dips to the rhythm of nearby bells or drums, turning punishment into a macabre kind of performance art. One account mentions a victim so adept at maintaining balance that townsfolk began to bet on how long she could remain upright, a strange precursor to medieval reality TV. You imagine yourself strapped in the chair, every muscle tense, your toes brushing the water, the crowd's eyes drilling into you. Each tilt is a shock, both physically and psychologically, forcing your body to brace while your mind reels from embarrassment. The splashes, the squeak of wet wood, and the laughter around you create a sensory overload that leaves you exhausted even before the ordeal ends. Psychologically, the ducking stool worked as effectively as a public lecture. Your fear, discomfort, and shame were amplified by spectators who simultaneously learned and reinforced communal norms. You notice how even the smallest misstep, a squeal, a flinch, or a misjudged tilt, could ignite laughter or scolding from the crowd, blending education, correction, and entertainment into one seamless ritual. Finally, the executioner gently releases the straps, and the drenched victim scrambles to the bank, shivering and humiliated. Children chase after, mimicking the movements, while adults murmur about lessons learned. You step back, reflecting on the ingenuity and cruelty intertwined in medieval punishments, and realize that public humiliation was often just as powerful and sometimes more memorable than physical pain. The ritual, the audience, and the ritualized movement of the chair created an experience that was impossible to forget. A vivid example of how creativity and control merged in medieval justice. You move away from the splashing pond, the smell of mud and damp linen lingering faintly in your nostrils, and soon find yourself facing a row of wooden posts with leather straps hanging loosely from them. This is the whipping post, a centerpiece of medieval corporal punishment. You watch as a man is tied upright, back exposed, awaiting lashes from a thin leather whip. The air carries the sharp tang of sweat, horses, and a faint metallic tang, perhaps from nearby chains or nails. You probably wouldn't survive the sting without flinching, but the crowd seems to take an almost clinical interest in the procedure, their whispers and gasps filling the space between strikes. Historically, whipping posts were widely used across Europe to punish petty thieves, debtors, and moral offenders. Mainstream records indicate that the number of lashes often followed strict legal prescriptions, but executioners sometimes exceeded limits, citing the need to teach a lesson. Historians still argue whether the punishment served more as a deterrent for others or primarily as a method of social spectacle. But both aspects are evident. A quirky tidbit: in some towns, spectators would place bets on how many lashes the victim could endure, adding a bizarre gambling element to punishment. In a few accounts, children were encouraged to mimic the whipping motions with sticks, turning the serious event into a public performance that reinforced communal norms through participation. You can almost imagine a medieval version of a spectator sport, minus the popcorn, but with plenty of moralizing commentary. Standing there, you imagine yourself strapped to that post, muscles tensing with anticipation. The whip strikes. First a sharp sting, then a series of jolting pains that travel through your back. Each strike is punctuated by the gasps of the crowd, the flinch of the victim, and the squeak of leather. The sensation is more than physical. It's a rhythmic reminder that your actions are being judged by everyone around you, your body a canvas for communal morality. The psychological impact is significant. Even after the lashes end, the anticipation, the humiliation, and the public attention linger. You notice subtle cues, how some spectators avert their eyes, how others lean in to see the marks develop, and how children imitate or mimic, learning lessons in obedience and social boundaries through observation. A modern viewer might liken this to a tense game show or endurance challenge, yet without any safety precautions. Pain, humiliation, and morality were intertwined, creating a visceral spectacle that left long-lasting impressions. As the man is finally released, rubbing his back and grimacing, the crowd murmurs a mixture of satisfaction, sympathy, and moral approval. You step back, reflecting on how medieval justice relied as much on the eyes and minds of the audience as on the body of the punished, a lesson in power, control, and theatricality that resonates through centuries. Leaving the whipping posts behind, you find yourself in a quieter alley where an odd contraption leans against a wall. It looks like a miniature catapult, though its purpose is far from recreational. This device, sometimes called a catapult of shame, was designed to hurl minor offenders, or at least their belongings, through the air as part of a public spectacle. The crowd gathers, half in amusement, half in awe, as the operator demonstrates its use with a basket of produce, sending apples and cabbages flying. You probably wouldn't survive being launched yourself, but watching it in action is oddly mesmerizing. Historically, medieval towns often improvised inventive punishment devices, especially for minor crimes. While mainstream records are sparse, surviving accounts show that these contraptions were used in Northern Europe and occasionally in festival settings to reinforce social norms and entertain crowds. Historians still argue whether the main intent was deterrence, punishment, or sheer theatrical amusement, and likely it was a blend of all three, a quirky tidbit. In some villages, the catapult was adapted for pranks, with children and townsfolk predicting trajectories, timing releases, and even adding humorous sound effects. One account describes a mischievous operator rigging it so that a fish would land atop a passing magistrate's hat, causing uproarious laughter. The boundaries between punishment, play, and chaos were delightfully blurred. You imagine standing in front of the device, heart racing, knowing the next misstep could see you, or at least your shoes, flying through the air. The tension is almost tactile. The creak of timber, the snap of rope, the anticipatory murmur of the crowd. The device is more than machinery. It's a theater prop, a lesson, and a source of fear, all in one. Psychologically, this combines embarrassment with the thrill of unpredictability. Unlike whipping or stocks, the catapult introduces a game element, making spectators participants in the unfolding drama. You notice the subtle social dynamics, those laughing the loudest, often have the least to fear, while the target of the device must navigate humiliation and chaos simultaneously. In a modern lens, this might be a viral stunt or a reality competition. Yet in medieval times, it was tangible, immediate, and unavoidable. You step back, taking in the ingenuity and absurdity, realizing that punishment could be as creative as it was cruel. The line between discipline and spectacle is thin, and the catapult of shame proves that medieval justice often flirted with both, leaving you with an odd mixture of amusement, horror, and fascination. The alley narrows further, opening onto a shadowed courtyard where an iron chair sits ominously. This is the heretic's iron chair, a punishment designed to enforce compliance through discomfort rather than outright injury. You notice the seat is studded with small iron points, enough to make sitting an exercise in controlled agony. A man is placed upon it, chains securing him while the executioner adjusts straps that dig subtly into his shoulders and back. The air is heavy with sweat, dust, and the faint scent of burnt wood from nearby torches. You probably wouldn't survive even a few minutes on this chair, but observing it is both horrifying and oddly mesmerizing. Historically, these chairs were employed across Germany, France, and England to punish heresy, dissent, or disobedience. Mainstream accounts indicate they were as much tools of interrogation as punishment, creating prolonged discomfort to elicit compliance or confession. Historians still argue whether the chairs were more effective psychologically than physically, but anecdotal evidence suggests the victims often broke under prolonged use without serious physical injury. A quirky tidbit: some chairs had detachable spikes that could be adjusted for height, angle, or intensity, allowing the executioner to customize the experience. In a few documented cases, chairs were placed on wheels, so the victim could be paraded through the streets while enduring discomfort, a walking lesson in submission. The absurd creativity of medieval engineers knew few bounds. You imagine yourself strapped into that chair, iron points pressing into your thighs and back, every breath a reminder of vulnerability. The subtle shift of weight sends shivers of pain through muscles that strain to compensate, while your mind reels at the humiliation of being paraded, restrained, and observed. Each creak of the chair under your weight resonates like a drumbeat, marking the passage of your ordeal. Psychologically, the heretic's chair was designed to create anticipation, dread, and hyper-awareness. Observers learned from the visible tension, understanding that deviation from societal norms could lead to both discomfort and public shame. You notice the crowd's reactions, some fascinated, some empathetic, others grimly approving. This interplay of observation and endurance creates a rich, almost theatrical experience. In modern terms, it's reminiscent of extreme endurance challenges, but without safety precautions, edits, or applause. Pain, social pressure, and spectacle converge seamlessly. You step away, reflecting on the medieval genius for combining morality, creativity, and sensory manipulation, leaving a lasting imprint on both victim and observer. The iron chair demonstrates that punishment can be as much psychological theater as physical constraint, and its eerie elegance lingers in your mind as you move toward the next display of historical ingenuity. You leave the iron chair behind, following a narrow passage where the scent of damp stone mingles with faint smoke from nearby hearths. Ahead, A massive wooden frame dominates the space. The rack, a device designed to stretch the human body in precise, terrifying increments. The victim lies supine, wrists and ankles bound to rollers at either end, and as the executioner turns the cranks, the body slowly elongates, joints straining, muscles screaming in silent agony. You probably wouldn't survive more than a few minutes under this tension, yet witnessing it is a visceral lesson in medieval ingenuity and cruelty. Historically, the rack was employed throughout Europe from the late Middle Ages into the 17th century, primarily for extracting confessions or punishing treachery. Mainstream accounts note that it caused severe discomfort and potential long-term damage, but not immediate death, allowing inquisitors or local authorities to prolong suffering for social or judicial effect. Historians still argue whether the rack's primary purpose was extraction of truth or purely deterrence. Evidence suggests both aims often coexisted, intertwined with public spectacle. A quirky tidbit: in some regions, small bells were attached to the rollers so that each turn jingled loudly, warning the crowd of the victim's progress and amplifying psychological stress. One account mentions a particularly clever operator who synchronized turns with town bells, creating a rhythmic performance that reminded observers of both law and fear. Medieval ingenuity knew few bounds when it came to combining art, punishment, and community involvement. You imagine yourself stretched along that wooden frame, the rollers tugging at your wrists, ankles, and joints. Each rotation is measured, deliberate. Every fiber of your being protests, and yet the audience observes in silence and fascination. The sound of ropes straining, wood creaking, and occasional gasps creates a symphony of discomfort. Physically, you are at your limit. Psychologically, even more so, as the awareness of helplessness and public scrutiny compounds the pain. The rack is a perfect example of how medieval punishments combined physical pain with psychological theater. The anticipation of each turn, the creaking of wood under tension, and the faint rustle of spectators all serve to heighten the victim's torment. You notice how small acts, a twitch, a grimace, can elicit gasps, laughter, or murmurs from the crowd, reinforcing social lessons. In modern imagination, it could resemble extreme fitness or stunt challenges, but without safety protocols, the experience is utterly immersive, terrifying, and memorable. You step away sensing that medieval justice was not only about enforcing laws, but orchestrating experiences that lingered, engraved in memory and body alike. The rack demonstrates that pain, when coupled with anticipation and public observation, can be as performative as it is punitive, a chilling reminder of how creativity and cruelty intertwined in historical justice systems. The creak of the rack fades behind you as you navigate through a dimly lit square where a massive spoked wheel dominates the center. This is the infamous breaking wheel, a device both feared and morbidly fascinating. The condemned is tied to its spokes, arms and legs spread wide, and the executioner raises a heavy iron cudgel. The crowd surrounds the scene, some averting their eyes, others leaning in with morbid curiosity, waiting for the rhythmic thuds that signal the first blows. You probably wouldn't survive the ordeal physically or emotionally, but the spectacle is mesmerizing in its calculated brutality. Historically, the breaking wheel was used primarily in France, Germany, and parts of Eastern Europe for capital punishment, especially for heinous crimes like murder or treason. Mainstream records confirm that it involved breaking limbs in a methodical sequence, prolonging death, and maximizing suffering as a deterrent. Historians still argue whether the ritualized aspects of the wheel, its display, the timing of strikes, the public gathering, served more as community theater or genuine justice, though both aspects are evident. A quirky tidbit. In some regions, the wheel was decorated with carvings or painted with bright colors, transforming the grim device into a perverse kind of stage prop. Townsfolk would place bets on which limb would be struck first or how long the victim would endure, adding a layer of dark entertainment to the punishment. Children often mimicked the wheel with hoops or wagon wheels, oblivious to the gravity, highlighting how spectacle shaped societal norms from a young age. You imagine lying across the spokes, limbs splayed, every thud resonating through your bones, the air filled with gasps, whispers, and occasional laughter. The sound of wood cracking, metal striking, and the muted groans of the victim create a haunting rhythm, a grim symphony orchestrated for the crowd. The psychological weight is immense. Helplessness and public observation compound physical agony, making the experience as mentally taxing as it is painful. The breaking wheel was as much about instruction as it was punishment. Observers learned lessons in obedience, fear, and morality while experiencing a form of entertainment they had been conditioned to accept. The ritual was deliberate, positioning the body, the sequence of strikes, and the public spectacle all worked to reinforce communal rules. In a modern lens, it's like a lethal combination of performance art and punishment, though with stakes infinitely higher. You step back, shivering despite the warmth of the day, realizing that medieval punishments were meticulously designed to leave indelible marks on mind, body, and community alike. The breaking wheel exemplifies how punishment could transcend simple retribution, becoming an elaborate, chilling theater of power and control. From the gruesome wheel, you wander toward the outskirts of town, where a lone gibbet stands on a low hill, silhouetted against the fading sun. Suspended from its iron frame is a corpse, long dead but still clothed in tattered rags, swinging slightly in the breeze. The smell is faint but unmistakable, earthy decay mixed with the metallic tang of rusting iron. You probably wouldn't survive the psychological impact of this scene without shivering, but the gibbet was never meant for comfort. It was a statement, a warning, visible for miles. Historically, gibbets were used to display executed criminals, particularly murderers and pirates, as a long-term deterrent. Mainstream records note that bodies were left suspended until they decomposed entirely, creating a gruesome, permanent reminder of consequences. Historians still argue whether gibbeting was primarily a psychological deterrent or a method to prevent burial rites and shame the family, though both motives appear in surviving documents. A quirky tidbit: in some coastal towns, bodies in gibbets were occasionally dressed with signs indicating the crime or adorned with hats and props, almost like grim mannequins teaching morality. Some accounts even mention curious travelers stopping to sketch the scene or purchase souvenirs of the spectacle, a morbid form of medieval tourism. You imagine climbing the hill, the wind tugging at your clothes, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows across the swinging corpse. The body shifts slightly with the breeze, producing a soft creak from the chains, a haunting rhythm that seems almost musical in its persistence. Spectators might have whispered prayers, cursed the dead, or simply stared, absorbing the lesson in silent contemplation. The gibbet's power lay in visibility and permanence. Unlike the fleeting embarrassment of stocks or barrels, the suspended corpse became part of the landscape, integrating punishment into daily life. Children would learn fear and obedience by observing. Adults would discuss morality and justice, and travelers would carry stories from town to town, spreading the specter of law far beyond its immediate location. Psychologically, gibbeting imposed both horror and reflection. The body's decay reminded onlookers that crime had tangible, lasting consequences and that justice could extend beyond death. The communal experience, shared horror, whispered discussions, and morbid fascination ensured that the lesson was internalized, making the gibbet a powerful, multi-layered instrument of societal control. You step down the hill, leaving the swaying body behind, and realize that medieval punishment was often as much about presence and psychological influence as about immediate pain. The gibbet teaches that sometimes the mere sight of consequence is enough to govern behavior, making the town itself a theater of justice, where every observer is both audience and pupil. You leave the hill and follow a narrow path leading into a shadowed courtyard where a small cage-like structure awaits, the bird cage punishment used to confine offenders in a public elevated space. A man is perched inside, barely able to move, the metal bars pressing against his sides. The cage is suspended from a wooden beam hoisted several feet above the ground so passers-by can gawk at him from below. The air smells faintly of rust and sweat, with a hint of nearby cooking fires. You probably wouldn't survive the combination of humiliation, discomfort, and exposure. Yet the spectacle draws your attention irresistibly. Historically, birdcage punishments were employed in various European towns to punish thieves, scolds, or minor social offenders. Mainstream accounts emphasize public embarrassment as the main objective. Being hoisted above ground restricted movement and made the victim highly visible. Historians still argue whether the height added a physical threat or primarily enhanced the social humiliation, but both elements are clear, a quirky tidbit. In some instances, cages were decorated with colorful paint or inscriptions of the offender's crime, making the person a literal display of shame. One amusing account describes a local prankster slipping a feathered hat into the cage, transforming the man into a walking, dangling caricature. Children would point, laugh, and imitate, while adults murmured moral lessons, blending punishment and entertainment seamlessly. You imagine being strapped inside that metal cage, feet dangling, arms pinned, swaying slightly with the wind. The limited space forces awkward angles, making each breath and movement uncomfortable. The crowd's eyes are unrelenting, their whispered judgments magnifying your sense of exposure. Each tilt of the cage, each gust of wind becomes a small battle between dignity and absurdity. Psychologically, this punishment operates on dual levels: confinement and spectacle. The cage imposes physical restraint while leveraging social pressure, making the observer complicit in reinforcing norms. The elevated position adds vulnerability, making the victim feel both trapped and observed from every angle. In a modern lens, it's reminiscent of a literal public time out, though without privacy or dignity. You step away, realizing that medieval punishment often combined physical discomfort with social embarrassment, turning every public space into a theater where control, creativity, and community judgment coalesced. The birdcage illustrates the imaginative, often theatrical lengths societies went to enforce order and compliance. The birdcage sways gently behind you as you navigate through a quiet alley, where a curious device stands against a stone wall, the jog, or neck yoke. A sturdy wooden beam is fitted with iron rings, designed to encircle the offender's neck and sometimes wrists, chaining them to a post or wall. A man leans against the post, head pressed forward uncomfortably, arms locked in place. The air smells faintly of damp stone and wood smoke, and the murmur of nearby townsfolk carries on the wind. You probably wouldn't survive the hours of immobility without your patience or your pride, but the spectacle is oddly compelling. Historically, the joug was employed primarily in Scottish and Northern English towns to punish minor criminals, debtors, or insolent individuals. Mainstream records indicate it was a temporary form of public humiliation and restraint, often used alongside verbal reprimands or minor corporal punishment. Historians still argue whether the main objective was discipline, deterrence, or community entertainment, but evidence suggests it fulfilled all three functions depending on context. A quirky tidbit: in some villages, bells were attached to the neck yoke, producing jingling sounds whenever the victim shifted or fidgeted. One anecdote even describes a man cleverly tilting his head to orchestrate a rhythm, creating an unintended, almost musical performance. Children imitated the sounds with sticks, while adults shook their heads in a mix of amusement and disapproval. You imagine being fitted with the jog, the heavy wood pressing against your shoulders and neck, restricting movement while forcing you into an awkward posture. Every breath and shift becomes an effort, muscles stiffening from prolonged immobility. The crowd's eyes, whispering judgments, magnify the humiliation, turning restraint into a socially interactive form of punishment. Psychologically, the joug imposes both physical limitation and social pressure. Its simplicity belies its effectiveness. By combining discomfort with public observation, it reinforces societal norms without extreme physical harm. The subtle tension of chains, the constant awareness of being watched, and the minor inconvenience create a pervasive sense of vulnerability. Viewed today, the joug could resemble an extreme freeze challenge or public endurance test, though without pause buttons or edited relief. You step away, appreciating how medieval justice often employed ingenuity, restraint, and spectacle to teach lessons, blending humiliation and ingenuity into punishments that were physically minor but socially unforgettable. The joug, small yet potent, demonstrates that sometimes subtlety and exposure can be as effective as brute force. The echo of clanking chains fades as you wander toward a bustling square where a peculiar contraption dominates the scene. The pillory, a wooden framework, its head and hands locked through precisely carved holes, secures a man in a rigid, upright position. Crowds encircle him, some jeering, others tossing rotten fruit or mud, the smell of decay mingling with nearby bakery scents. You probably wouldn't survive the relentless glares and pelted produce without wincing, yet the pillory spectacle is impossible to ignore. Historically, pillories were widely used across Europe from the Middle Ages into the early modern period. Mainstream accounts note that offenders might spend hours or even a full day immobilized, enduring public ridicule. Historians still argue whether the primary function was punitive, corrective, or purely performative, but the combination of shame, discomfort, and communal attention seems deliberately orchestrated. A quirky tidbit: some towns customize pillories with carved faces, inscriptions, or humorous adornments to amplify embarrassment. In one record, a clever offender managed to tip a small basket over himself, spilling peas and creating an unintentional comedic effect that left the crowd laughing while still reinforcing his punishment. Children often mimic the act with dolls or small wooden contraptions, absorbing social lessons early. You imagine stepping into the pillory yourself, head and hands immobilized, neck and wrists aching, every muscle straining to compensate. The crowd's eyes bore into you from every direction, each toss of mud or tomato punctuating humiliation with tactile immediacy. Even a minor slip, an awkward tilt or muffled groan, becomes amplified in the public gaze, a reminder that in medieval towns, social observation was a potent tool of control. Psychologically, the pillory blends physical restraint with public shaming, teaching both the punished and the community about obedience and social norms. You notice subtle details: the whispered commentary of the crowd, the laughter of children, the sympathetic glance of a passerby. All these combine into a multi-layered lesson in societal boundaries, delivered with minimal violence but maximum impact. In modern imagination, it resembles a viral prank gone wrong or a live social experiment, yet in the Middle Ages, there were no cameras or edited footage. The humiliation was immediate, unfiltered, and communal. You step away, reflecting on the ingenuity of medieval justice. Even simple wood and straps could wield extraordinary psychological power, transforming restraint into theater, pain into lesson, and public observation into enduring social influence. The pillory, small but dramatic, proves that in medieval punishment, humiliation was often more enduring than the physical sting. You leave the pillory behind, wandering down a cobblestone lane lined with timbered houses. Ahead, a wooden scaffold holds a peculiar contraption: the stocks, a low horizontal frame with holes for the feet and sometimes the hands. A man sits in the stocks, legs extended, ankles secured in the grooves, his body awkwardly twisted. The air smells faintly of wood, leather, and nearby livestock, blending into the subtle stench of human sweat. You probably wouldn't survive sitting like that for hours under the gaze of townsfolk, yet the scene draws your attention like a magnet. Historically, stocks were widely employed across medieval Europe to punish minor offenders such as drunks, petty thieves, or those accused of disorderly conduct. Mainstream accounts describe the stocks as tools for both physical discomfort and public humiliation. Victims endured awkward postures, exposure to weather, and ridicule. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose was deterrence or entertainment, though evidence indicates it served both, creating communal lessons in obedience and decorum. A quirky tidbit: in some villages, pranksters would toss vegetables, snowballs, or even small objects at those in stocks, adding a layer of interactive spectacle. One account tells of a clever victim who wiggled enough to create a faint musical rhythm, earning an unusual applause while still enduring discomfort. Children often imitated the act with small wooden blocks, internalizing norms and social lessons early on. You imagine being trapped in the stocks, legs immobilized, ankles sore, muscles stiffening in unnatural positions. Each passing hour amplifies discomfort, while the eyes of the crowd magnify embarrassment. Even minor reactions, shifting weight, wincing, or a grimace, draw attention and commentary, turning physical restraint into an interactive social lesson. Psychologically, the stocks blend endurance, exposure, and communal observation. The simplicity of wood and hinges is deceptive. It forces introspection and social conformity through enforced visibility. You notice subtle social dynamics, laughter, sympathy, murmurs of moral judgment, all contributing to a lesson in compliance and community standards. Viewed through a modern lens, it resembles a forced public timeout or endurance challenge, yet without reprieve or privacy. You step away, reflecting on how medieval justice often relied on prolonged discomfort and communal observation rather than extreme physical violence. The stocks demonstrate that even simple, low-tech devices could orchestrate complex lessons in social control, leaving memories of both pain and public scrutiny that lasted long after release. You wander further, the din of the marketplace fading as you enter a shadowed square where a grim wooden frame rises above the cobblestones, the scold's bridle, also known as the brank. A woman sits on a low stool beneath it, her head encased in an iron mask with a protruding gag pressing against her tongue. The metal is cold and unyielding, straps clamping her head firmly in place. The air smells faintly of iron and sweat, punctuated by the distant aroma of baking bread. You probably wouldn't survive even a short time in this contraption without panicking, but watching it is both fascinating and horrifying. Historically, scold's bridles were used in England and parts of Europe to punish women accused of gossiping, nagging, or spreading rumors. Mainstream records indicate that the device was intended to silence offenders publicly, combining physical discomfort with social humiliation. Historians still argue whether the practice targeted women specifically to enforce gender norms or if it was part of broader moral regulation. But evidence suggests both motives played a role. A quirky tidbit: in some towns, decorative flourishes were added to the bridle, such as iron spikes, bells, or engraved patterns. One account mentions a mischievous prankster dangling small objects from the mask, turning punishment into an unintended spectacle. Children would mimic the sound of the bells, while adults whispered lessons about obedience and speech. You imagine being trapped in the bridle, jaw forced open, tongue pressed painfully against iron, every attempt to speak punished instantly by discomfort. The crowd observes, some laughing quietly, others grimacing in sympathy. Every movement, tilt of the head, or attempted murmur is amplified, creating a surreal mix of fear, embarrassment, and helplessness. Psychologically, the bridle enforced silence as punishment, blending restraint with public spectacle. The victim's inability to communicate amplified humiliation, while observers internalized lessons about speech, behavior, and social norms. You notice how the device, though simple, transforms an everyday action, speaking, into a site of power, control, and theatrical instruction. In a modern lens, it resembles a forced mute challenge or extreme performance art, but without safety or consent. You step away, reflecting on how medieval punishments often merged physical discomfort, social observation, and moral instruction. The scold's bridle, small but fearsome, illustrates the creativity and severity of historical justice, leaving impressions not just on the body, but on the mind of both victim and observer. The echo of clanking metal fades as you navigate a narrow lane toward a quiet courtyard, where a strange, triangular wooden frame sits on a pedestal, the shame triangle, or cucking stool variant. A man is seated on a plank, bent forward with his hands tied behind him, legs dangling awkwardly. The frame lifts him slightly above the ground, making movement difficult and positioning him at eye level with the gathering crowd. The air carries the scent of wood, damp earth, and faint smoke, mingling with whispers and snickers from onlookers. You probably wouldn't survive sitting like this under public scrutiny without squirming. Yet the ritualized discomfort draws your fascination. Historically, these triangular frames were used in England and the Low Countries to punish minor offenses, particularly scolding or disruptive behavior. Mainstream records note that the combination of awkward posture and public display induced both embarrassment and physical strain, emphasizing social conformity. Historians still argue whether the primary goal was correction, deterrence, or community entertainment. But the overlapping purposes are clear. A quirky tidbit. In some villages, the frame was painted bright colors or decorated with carvings depicting the crime, turning the victim into a literal lesson in wood. Children often mimic the setup using sticks or small furniture, reinforcing communal expectations from a young age. One account describes a prankster tying a small bell to the frame so every twitch rang out, creating an unintended musical accompaniment to humiliation. You imagine being forced into the triangle, muscles straining to support your bent posture, wrists sore, legs dangling awkwardly. Every small adjustment becomes painful, every movement observed and commented upon. The crowd's reactions, giggling, murmuring, or shaking their heads, magnify the psychological impact, turning a simple physical restraint into a layered, interactive lesson. Psychologically, the shame triangle exemplifies how posture, exposure, and social observation were weaponized to teach compliance. The awkward physicality enforces discomfort, while the communal gaze reinforces shame and moral instruction. The device's effectiveness depends less on pain and more on the victim's awareness of being scrutinized, creating a powerful, lasting impression. In modern imagination, it could resemble an extreme public yoga challenge or performance art piece. But without choice or safety, you step back, appreciating the ingenuity of medieval punishment. Small, simple devices could manipulate both body and mind, delivering lessons in compliance, humiliation, and spectacle all at once. The shame triangle, modest in scale, demonstrates that medieval justice often relied on creativity, social dynamics, and psychological pressure as much as brute force. You continue down the winding street until you reach a small, murky pond at the edge of the village, where a curious wooden plank extends over the water like a precarious diving board. This is the infamous ducking stool, designed to punish and humiliate, particularly for women accused of gossiping, scolding, or minor offenses. A woman is strapped into the chair, arms bound, ankles secured, and the operator prepares to tip her forward into the chilly water. The air is thick with the scent of pondweed, damp wood, and the faint tang of iron from the chair's fittings. You probably wouldn't survive the combination of shock, wet clothing, and public embarrassment without shivering, yet watching the ritual is mesmerizing in its rhythm and precision. Historically, ducking stools were used in England, Scotland, and parts of the Low Countries from the 16th into the 18th centuries. Mainstream accounts describe repeated immersion as a form of public humiliation and mild physical punishment, rather than lethal harm. Historians still argue whether the procedure was intended primarily to discipline, entertain, or provide a moral lesson, but the repetitive and public nature clearly served multiple social functions. A quirky tidbit: in some villages, operators decorated the stool with carvings or bells, and children would mimic the dunking motion on small wooden chairs, turning the punishment into a form of play and early moral education. One humorous account describes a prankster rigging a pulley system that dunked the chair twice unexpectedly, eliciting gasps and laughter from the crowd. You imagine being seated in the ducking stool, water rising around your ankles, the chair tilting forward, heart pounding as the first splash hits. The chill of water, the sensation of helplessness, and the watching eyes combine to create a uniquely intense form of discomfort. Even after being lifted from the pond, dripping and shivering, the embarrassment lingers, magnified by the public spectacle and the communal judgment. Psychologically, the ducking stool blends physical discomfort, surprise, and public shaming into a single experience. The ritual teaches both the punished and the observers about acceptable behavior, reinforcing societal norms in an immersive, almost theatrical way. Viewed today, it's reminiscent of a forced dunk challenge in a water park, but with no safety instructions or laughs from friends, making the experience starkly different. You step back, realizing that medieval justice often transformed ordinary objects into instruments of moral instruction, humiliation, and community spectacle. The ducking stool, simple yet effective, shows that punishment need not be lethal to leave an indelible mark on both body and mind. The murmur of the pond fades behind you as you approach a narrow street where a strange, slatted platform stands elevated above the ground. The whipping post. A man is tied to it, back exposed, awaiting lashes from a stout leather whip. The air is tinged with the sharp scent of tanned leather and faintly of sweat and dust from the crowd pressing close. You probably wouldn't survive the sting of repeated lashes or the humiliation of public observation, yet the scene holds a grim fascination that is impossible to look away from. Historically, whipping posts were ubiquitous across medieval Europe and colonial settlements alike. Mainstream accounts describe the practice as a form of corporal punishment designed to inflict pain without causing death, often accompanied by public humiliation. Historians still argue whether whipping was primarily a deterrent, a retributive measure, or a ritualistic spectacle, though surviving records suggest it served all three functions. A quirky tidbit: in some towns, operators would mark the rhythm of lashes with small bells or chants, turning the punishment into a kind of macabre performance. In rare cases, creative locals even choreographed sequences, ensuring the crowd remained engaged while the victim endured repetitive discomfort. Children would mimic the motions with sticks, unknowingly internalizing the lesson in obedience and communal norms. You imagine being bound to the post, shoulders tense, back exposed, every lash leaving a fleeting sting that amplifies the anticipation of the next one. The crowd reacts with gasps, murmurs, and occasional laughter, heightening the psychological intensity. Each swing of the whip becomes a measure of both physical endurance and social submission, a rhythmic lesson in compliance. Psychologically, the whipping post demonstrates the interplay of pain, anticipation, and social observation. Physical punishment is compounded by the crowd's presence, turning individual suffering into a communal lesson. The spectacle ensures that both participants and observers absorb moral instruction, reinforcing societal boundaries through direct, visceral experience. In a modern perspective, it could resemble an extreme endurance challenge broadcast live, but without editing, safety nets, or escape. You step away, reflecting on the ingenuity of medieval justice. Simple devices and repetitive actions could deliver complex moral lessons combining pain, embarrassment, and spectacle. The whipping post, stark and unadorned, encapsulates the medieval philosophy that punishment should instruct, deter, and entertain simultaneously, leaving lessons on both body and mind long after the act concludes. The shadows lengthen as you walk away from the alleyways, squares, and courtyards, each device lingering in your mind like an echo. The sights, smells, and sensations of the medieval punishments fade into a gentle haze, replaced by a calm awareness of the ingenuity and the cruelty that shaped everyday life centuries ago. You notice the subtle rhythm of the town returning, the soft clatter of carts, the distant laughter of children, the warm glow of hearth fires spilling from windows. These remnants of life remind you that punishment was woven into the fabric of community, yet the world was never only harsh, it was also inventive, theatrical, and oddly human. Imagine the scenes you've witnessed dissolving slowly into the distance. The stocks, the rack, the birdcage, and the ducking stool blend together in memory, their lessons softening from terror to curiosity. Each contraption, once vivid and immediate, now feels like a story whispered across time, carrying lessons about obedience, fear, resilience, and the fascinating ways societies enforce norms. You feel a quiet gratitude for safety, comfort, and freedom, sensing how far human systems have evolved while appreciating the remarkable creativity that defined historical justice. As you exhale slowly, the sounds of the medieval town become faint, replaced by the quiet of your own space. You imagine the clinking chains, the swaying gibbets, and the cool splash of water fading gently, leaving only a soft hum of understanding. The lessons of history are now less about shock and more about reflection, an awareness of how human ingenuity, spectacle, and morality intertwine. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let the images drift peacefully away, carrying a gentle mixture of fascination, awe, and relief. Sleep arrives softly, guided by the echoes of lessons learned and the lingering whispers of lives long past. End of script. Sweet dreams.